The calm that feels wrong, when silence after conflict is not peace. It doesn't begin with shouting. It doesn't end with slammed doors or cruel words. It begins with something far more unsettling. Silence. You finally said what needed to be said. Maybe it happened late at night in a quiet apartment or during a tense conversation after weeks of holding things in. You were calm, clear. You didn't attack. You didn't beg. You simply drew a line and told the truth. And instead of the explosion you braced yourself for, everything went quiet. No rage, no defensiveness, no dramatic reaction, just an eerie calm. At first it feels like relief. Your body exhales, your heart slows. You tell yourself this must be a good sign. Maybe this person finally understands. Maybe maturity finally showed up. Maybe the storm has passed. But deep down, something doesn't sit right. The silence feels cold, not peaceful. Controlled, not reflective. There's no warmth in it, no vulnerability, no real engagement. It's as if the emotional lights were turned off without explanation. And that discomfort you feel, that subtle sense that something is wrong, that is not paranoia, that is perception. Because not all calm means resolution. Some calm means danger has gone underground. For healthy people, silence after conflict is often a pause for regulation, a moment to process, to cool down, to think more clearly. It's a bridge toward repair. It carries the promise of accountability and reconnection. But for someone driven by narcissistic dynamics, silence serves a very different purpose. It is not peace. It is not growth. It is not acceptance. It is pause. A pause designed to regroup, reassess, and recalibrate power. This is the part most people misunderstand because they project their own psychology onto the situation. They think, if I went quiet, it would be because I'm reflecting. They assume the other person is doing the same. But while you are recovering, while you are replaying the conversation in your head, while you are cautiously hopeful that something shifted, the narcissistic mind is not reflecting. It is calculating. When a narcissistic personality is confronted in a way that threatens their self-image, especially by someone they once felt superior to or in control of, they do not metabolize the feedback. They cannot sit with shame. They cannot integrate fault without collapsing or retaliating, so instead they withdraw. And that withdrawal is not emotional rest, it is strategic retreat. And the calm you're witnessing is not the absence of conflict, it is the suspension of it. The moment the battle stops being loud and starts becoming quiet, this is where the real danger lies, because silence creates ambiguity, and ambiguity destabilizes people who care. You start filling in the gaps. You wonder if you were too harsh, too sensitive, too much. You begin to doubt your own clarity. That self-doubt is not accidental. It is a byproduct of the silence. What makes this calm especially deceptive is how polite it looks. Their tone softens. Their messages become neutral. They stop arguing. Sometimes they even say things like, "You're right," or "I understand," or "I just need some time." And if you're not careful, you interpret that as resolution, but notice what's missing. There is no accountability, no curiosity about your experience, no shared responsibility, no emotional risk on their part, just distance. Peace has a texture. It carries warmth, humility, and a willingness to stay present in discomfort. Strategic calm has none of that. It feels sterile, almost managerial, like a door quietly closing rather than opening. Your nervous system picks up on this before your mind does. That's why the calm feels wrong. That's why you can't relax into it. Your body knows that something unresolved is still moving beneath the surface. Because silence in this context is not meant to help you feel better. It's meant to cool you down. It gives them space to watch what you do next. Do you reach out? Do you apologize? Do you explain yourself again? Do you chase reassurance? Every reaction provides information. Each silence becomes a tool of observation. Calm becomes camouflage. And while you're breathing again, believing the worst is over, the groundwork is being laid for what comes next. This is why so many people say to Tom, everything seemed fine. Until it wasn't. The shift didn't announce itself, it didn't arrive with drama, it arrived quietly, wrapped in calm. Understanding this moment is crucial because the biggest mistake people make is rewarding this silence with trust. They lower their guard. They assume the danger has passed. And in doing so, they reopen access. And access is opportunity. This is not about becoming fearful or suspicious of every quiet moment. Not all silence is sinister. But when calm follows confrontation without accountability, without warmth, without genuine repair, it should make you alert. Not anxious, not reactive, but awake, because the silence is telling you something. It's telling you that the conflict didn't end. It changed form. And once you learn to recognize that, you stop mistaking danger for resolution. You stop confusing quiet with peace. And clarity begins to replace confusion. Before we go any further, if this resonates with you, if you've ever felt that unsettling calm after standing up for yourself, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us continue creating content that brings clarity to complex psychological dynamics, and it ensures you won't miss what comes next in this story. Now let me ask you a quick question to get you involved. Question. After a difficult confrontation, which feels more accurate to you? A. Silence usually means the conflict is resolved. B. Silence can be a warning sign that something is being planned. Comment A or B below. Your answer might reveal more than you think. The psychology behind narcissistic silence. Why withdrawal is a strategy, not healing. To understand why silence after confrontation feels so unsettling with a narcissistic personality, you have to look beneath behavior and into structure. Not what they say or don't say, but how their inner world is organized. Healing requires something very specific. It requires a self that is stable enough to absorb discomfort without fragmenting. It requires the ability to say, I was wrong, without experiencing that admission as annihilation. It requires shame tolerance, the capacity to feel exposed, imperfect, and human without immediately needing to escape or dominate. And this is precisely where narcissistic psychology breaks down. For someone driven by narcissistic dynamics, the self is not anchored internally. It is propped up externally. Identity is built on admiration, relevance, superiority, or control. These are not preferences, they are psychological necessities. They function like oxygen. When that supply is threatened, the system does not slow down to heal. It moves to survive. So when you confront them, calmly, firmly, without attacking, you are not just expressing a concern. You are interrupting the mechanism that keeps their self-image intact. You are forcing a moment where two realities collide: the image they rely on and the evidence that contradicts it. A healthy person feels pain in that moment and reflects. A narcissistic personality feels danger, and this is why withdrawal happens so quickly and so cleanly. Not because they are mature enough to step back, but because staying present would mean facing something they cannot integrate. Silence becomes an escape hatch. It removes them from the emotional line of fire without requiring accountability. But withdrawal is not emptiness. It is not rest. It is not neutral. It is reorganization. Inside that silence, the narcissistic mind is doing something very specific. It is scanning for damage. It is asking questions like, did I lose status? Did I lose leverage? Did I expose weakness? Did they gain power? The focus is not relational repair. It is hierarchical repair. This is why the emotional tone shifts so abruptly. One moment there is tension, the next there is calm distance. That shift is not resolution, it is triage, whom they are containing injury, not processing it. And because narcissistic personalities cannot afford to be seen as wounded, this entire process happens quietly. Outward calm becomes a mask for internal destabilization. What makes this especially confusing for you is that the behavior mimics healthy coping. We are taught that stepping away is wise, that silence can be respectful, that not escalating is maturity. Those lessons are true in emotionally integrated systems. But narcissistic silence uses the same form for a different function. In healthy withdrawal, the goal is regulation so that connection can resume. In narcissistic withdrawal, the goal is to prevent further loss while determining how control can be restored. The silence is not oriented toward you, it is oriented toward safety and dominance. And this distinction matters because it explains something people often struggle to articulate. Why the silence doesn't feel relieving even when the conflict stops. Your body knows that something unfinished is still moving. That's because silence in this context creates an asymmetry. You are left with questions. They are left with observation. You are exposed emotionally. They are concealed. This imbalance is not accidental. It favors the person who is least willing to be vulnerable. Withdrawal also serves another critical function. It preserves their image. If they stayed in the conversation, they might say something revealing. Defensive, cruel, petty. Something that would confirm what you are beginning to see. Silence protects them from themselves. It allows them to remain unprovable, untouchable, reasonable on the surface. And reasonableness is a powerful shield. Because when someone appears calm, distant, and controlled, they are often perceived as the more stable party. Even if they caused harm, even if they refused repair. Silence creates the illusion of strength. This is why narcissistic withdrawal is often paired with subtle moral framing later on. Once distance is established, it becomes easier to imply that they stepped back because they were trying to be mature or protecting their peace. The narrative benefits them even if the behavior never addressed the original issue. Another reason withdrawal is so effective is that it exploits your conscience. If you are reflective, empathetic, and capable of self-examination, silence activates those traits. You start reviewing your words, your tone, your timing. You wonder if you could have been kinder, be clearer, more patient. That introspection is healthy, but in this dynamic it is one-sided. While you are examining yourself, they are examining leverage. This is the quiet danger of narcissistic silence. It turns your strengths into vulnerabilities. Your desire for understanding becomes an opening. Your hope for repair becomes a pause they can use. And all of this happens without a single overtly hostile act. That is why it feels so disorienting. You cannot point to anything concrete. There is no accusation to respond to, no argument to resolve, just absence. And absence creates a vacuum that the human mind tries to fill. The crucial insight here is this. Withdrawal is not the end of narcissistic engagement. It is the transition from overt to covert control. Once direct engagement proves risky, the strategy evolves. Silence allows them to disengage emotionally while remaining psychologically involved. They are no longer interacting with you as a person. They are interacting with you as a variable, and variables are measured. This is also why you may notice that during this silent phase they seem oddly composed, even superior, as if they have already moved on. That appearance is intentional. It communicates something without saying it. I am unaffected. You did not touch me. But internally, the opposite is often true. The withdrawal is happening precisely because they were affected, because something landed that could not be dismissed, because staying present would mean losing ground. So they step back, not to heal, but to protect what they cannot afford to lose. Understanding this changes how you interpret the silence. One, you stop seeing it as a sign that things are over. You recognize it as a sign that something is being reorganized, and that awareness doesn't require you to panic or confront. It requires you to stay grounded. Because when you no longer mislabel withdrawal as growth, you stop cooperating with the illusion. And that alone begins to shift the balance of power quietly, steadily, and without drama. The moment you became a threat when you stopped playing the old role. There is a moment in every narcissistic dynamic that feels almost invisible when it happens, but it changes everything. It is not marked by shouting. It is not marked by defiance or rebellion. It is marked by absence. The absence of your old reactions. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't justify yourself. You didn't chase clarity. You didn't rush to repair their discomfort. You simply stopped performing the role they had grown accustomed to. And that is the moment you became a threat. For a long time, your presence in their life had a function. You were predictable. You responded in familiar ways. When tension appeared, you smoothed it over. When they withdrew, you leaned in. When they were disappointed, you explained yourself. When they were silent, you filled the space. None of this made you weak. It made you human, attuned, relational. But in a narcissistic system, those traits are not met with reciprocity. They are integrated into control. Over time, your emotional responsiveness became part of the architecture that kept their sense of importance intact. You mattered in a very specific way. You mattered because you reacted. So when you finally spoke clearly and then stopped, something fundamental shifted, and they noticed immediately. Not consciously, perhaps, but psychologically something registered. The usual emotional signals didn't arrive. The familiar pull wasn't there. The dynamic they relied on to orient themselves suddenly lacked feedback. And without feedback, uncertainty enters. This is where people often misunderstand what happens next. They assume the silence that follows means disengagement, that you've been downgraded, that you no longer matter enough to provoke a response. The truth is far more unsettling. You didn't become irrelevant. You became unpredictable, and unpredictability is experienced as danger. For someone whose inner stability depends on knowing where they stand in another person's emotional hierarchy, your shift creates a rupture. They no longer know if they still matter, if they still dominate, even if they are still feared, needed, or central. That uncertainty is intolerable, but instead of expressing it openly, through vulnerability or honest inquiry, they do something else. They stop engaging emotionally and start reassessing strategically. This is where the classification changes. You are no longer a source of validation. You are no longer a relational partner. You are no longer an emotional extension. You are now a variable, and variables are monitored. This is why the emotional tone often changes so abruptly. One moment there is tension, the next there is composure. One moment there is engagement, the next there is distance. It can feel like you've been quietly demoted without explanation. What's actually happening is internal recalibration. They are determining where you now stand relative to them. Are you still influenceable? Are you still emotionally reachable? Are you still invested enough to be guided back into the old pattern? And if the answer is unclear, the safest move, for them, is to pull back. Not because they no longer care, but because they care too much about control to risk exposure. This is why the silence that follows your shift feels different from previous silences. It's sharper, colder, more contained. There is less emotional leakage, less reactivity, more restraint. You feel it instinctively. Something about the air has changed. That's because the dynamic has crossed a psychological threshold. Before, the relationship functioned through emotional exchange. Now it functions through observation. They begin watching how you behave without prompting. Do you maintain your boundary? Do you soften with time? And do you return to familiar patterns once the tension fades? Every choice you make becomes information. And here is the part that is especially difficult to accept. This shift is not caused by cruelty or malice on your part. It is caused by growth. You did not attack them. You did not humiliate them. You did not seek dominance. You simply stopped compensating. And in a narcissistic dynamic, that is destabilizing. Because the old role you played helped regulate their internal world. It reassured them of their importance. It anchored their sense of superiority or centrality. When you step out of that role, the structure wobbles. That wobble is experienced as threat, not because you are dangerous, but because you are no longer predictable. This is why people are often confused by what follows. They think, if I mattered less, things would calm down. But instead, the tension goes quiet and dense. The emotional temperature drops, but the pressure increases. You may notice subtle changes, less warmth, more formality, a sense of being evaluated rather than engaged. It can feel as though the relationship has become strangely transactional or distant. That's because in their internal world it has. You are no longer being related to as a person. You are being assessed as a position. And positions can be adjusted. This is also why your intuition may start signaling caution even though nothing overt has happened. Your body senses that the rules have changed, that the ground beneath the relationship is no longer stable. You didn't announce this shift. You didn't declare independence. You simply acted differently. And that difference spoke louder than any argument ever could. The most unsettling part of this moment is that it often coincides with a sense of relief on your end. You feel clearer, lighter, more settled in yourself. You are no longer tangled in the same emotional loops. From your perspective, this feels like progress. From theirs, it feels like loss of position. And loss of position for someone organized around hierarchy and control is not neutral. It demands response. But that response rarely comes immediately, because now the relationship is no longer about connection. It is about recalculating power. Understanding this moment matters because it reframes what comes next. The silence is not confusion. The distance is not indifference. The composure is not acceptance. It is assessment. And once you see that clearly, you stop interpreting their withdrawal as a verdict on your worth. You recognize it as a reaction to your autonomy. You didn't become a problem because you spoke up. You became a threat because you stopped orbiting. And that is not a failure. It is the first real sign that the dynamic has begun to change, whether they like it or not. Silence as a weapon. How observation replaces confrontation. Once confrontation no longer works the way it used to, the dynamic does not end. It mutates. This is where many people make a critical mistake. They assume silence means withdrawal from the conflict itself. They believe the other person has stepped away emotionally, disengaged, or lost interest. And because the noise has stopped, the nervous system relaxes. The danger, it seems, has passed. But silence in a narcissistic dynamic is not absence, and it is repositioning. When direct confrontation no longer produces the desired effect, when you don't fold, don't chase, don't self-abandon, engagement becomes risky for them. Every word they say carries the possibility of exposure. Every emotional reaction reveals something they would rather keep hidden. So they stop speaking. And when they stop speaking, they start watching. This is the moment when silence becomes a weapon. Observation replaces confrontation not because they are done with you, but because observation is safer. It allows them to remain involved without being visible, to gather information without offering any of their own, to stay one step ahead without revealing intention. What feels like distance to you is actually a shift in strategy. You are no longer being interacted with, you are being studied, and that distinction matters. Because when someone engages with you directly, there is reciprocity. Even in conflict, there is exchange. When someone observes you silently, the relationship becomes asymmetrical. You are exposed, they are concealed. That imbalance creates pressure. Human beings are wired to respond to silence. We fill it. We interpret it. We try to resolve it. We search for meaning. And if you are a reflective, emotionally responsible person, you will often turn inward first. You'll ask yourself what you could have done differently. You'll review your words, your tone, your timing. Meanwhile, they are watching how you respond to the vacuum. Do you reach out to re-establish contact? Do you soften your boundaries with time? Do you begin acting normal again as if nothing happened? Do you doubt yourself and attempt to repair the emotional distance? Each of these responses answers a question for them. Silence gives them the advantage of time without cost. They are no longer risking emotional exposure, but they are still gathering data. And data, in this context, is not neutral. It is leverage. This is why the silence feels so heavy. It's not empty. It's charged. There is another layer to this that makes it even more destabilizing. Silence allows them to watch you without being watched in return. When someone speaks, they reveal position, emotion, intent. When someone is silent, they retain ambiguity, and ambiguity is power. You don't know what they're thinking. You don't know how they interpreted the confrontation. You don't know what they plan to do next. That uncertainty pulls your attention toward them, and an attention is currency. What's especially disorienting is that this observation phase often looks like maturity from the outside. They appear calm, reasonable, unbothered. They are no longer arguing or provoking openly. To others, they may even seem composed and dignified. But composure here is not emotional integration, it is containment. They are containing reaction so they can measure yours. This is why silence after confrontation often feels more unsettling than overt hostility. Hostility is loud, but clear. Silence is quiet, but ambiguous. And ambiguity keeps you guessing. You may start noticing subtle things during this phase. The way they seem aware of shifts in your behavior without asking. The way they reference changes in your life indirectly. The way a mutual acquaintance suddenly asks a strangely specific question. None of it is overt enough to confront, and that is intentional. Because confrontation would force clarity, and clarity is the enemy of covert control. Silence also allows them to test you indirectly. They may pull back just enough to see if you pursue, or they may remain neutral to see if you collapse the distance yourself. Every move you make becomes feedback. If you reach out, they learn that silence still pulls you toward them. If you explain yourself again, they learn that accountability can still be avoided. If you grow anxious or apologetic, they learn that emotional leverage remains intact. But if you don't react the way they expect, if you don't chase, don't fill the silence, don't abandon yourself, the dynamic shifts again. Because now, observation produces discomfort rather than reassurance. And this is where silence begins to harden. The longer you remain grounded and consistent, the less useful observation becomes. There is nothing dramatic to record, nothing exploitable, nothing to provoke reaction. And without emotional movement on your end, the weapon loses its edge. This is often when the silence becomes colder, more distant, less human, not because you failed, but because you disrupted the feedback loop. It's important to understand that this observation phase is not passive waiting. It is active monitoring. They are not detached. They are hyper-attentive. They are scanning for weakness, opportunity, or re-entry points. And this is where many people misinterpret what's happening. They think if they were still invested, they would say something. They assume interest equals engagement. But in narcissistic dynamics, engagement equals vulnerability. Observation preserves superiority. Watching allows them to feel involved without risking exposure. It allows them to maintain psychological presence while appearing absent. And that presence, felt but unseen, can be deeply destabilizing. You may begin to self-edit. You hesitate before sharing good news. You wonder who knows what. You feel a vague sense of being observed even when nothing concrete is happening. That internal shift is not accidental. When someone occupies your attention without occupying space, they exert influence without accountability. And influence without accountability is the core of narcissistic control. This is why silence is so effective. It doesn't force you into conflict, it pulls you into uncertainty, and uncertainty drains energy, it weakens boundaries, it tempts explanation. But here is the quiet reversal that happens when you understand what this silence is doing. When you stop interpreting silence as absence and start interpreting it as information, you regain orientation. You stop rushing to fill the void. You stop over-explaining. You stop performing for an unseen audience. And without emotional movement on your end, observation collapses. Because a weapon only works when it meets resistance. Silence relies on your reaction to have meaning. Without that reaction, it becomes just what it is, a tactic without fuel. And this is where the balance begins to shift. Not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through grounded non-participation. When you remain steady, clear, and consistent in the face of silence, you are no longer being measured, you are no longer feeding data into the system, and you are no longer available to be managed. And once observation fails to restore control, the strategy must change again. That is when silence stops being a weapon and becomes a signal that something else is coming. The sterile calm, why the absence of warmth is the warning. There is a particular kind of calm that does not soothe you. It doesn't settle your body or quiet your mind. Instead, it leaves you uneasy, alert, vaguely unsettled, like standing in a room where the lights are on but no one is home. Nothing is openly wrong, yet nothing feels right either. This is the sterile calm. It arrives after the silence has done its initial work, after the confrontation has ended, after emotions have cooled just enough for you to start breathing again. On the surface, everything looks stable. Conversations are civil. Responses are measured. There is no hostility to point to, no obvious tension to confront. And yet, the warmth is gone. Not anger, not conflict. Warmth. That absence is not accidental. It is the warning. In healthy relationships, calm carries connection. Even when people disagree or need space, there is a felt sense of humanity still present. Curiosity lingers. Concern remains. There is an underlying acknowledgement of shared reality. We are still here with each other, even if this is difficult. Sterile calm has none of that. It feels emotionally neutral in a way that is almost clinical. Interactions become efficient, polite, controlled. You are no longer being met, you are being managed. The emotional field narrows until only what is necessary remains. And this shift is deeply disorienting. Because the absence of warmth is harder to name than the presence of hostility. Anger is obvious. Distance masquerading as composure is not. The reason this calm feels so wrong is because it is not the result of resolution. It is the result of containment. Emotion has not been processed. It has been locked away. Not integrated, not expressed, suppressed. And suppression always has a purpose. In narcissistic dynamics, warmth is not freely given, it is transactional. It flows when the relational hierarchy feels secure. When that hierarchy is disrupted, when you stop playing the old role, when you stop providing emotional reassurance, warmth becomes risky. Warmth requires openness. Openness invites vulnerability. Vulnerability risks exposure, so the system shuts it down. What remains is a carefully regulated calm designed to do two things at once: prevent further injury and withhold information. Because warmth would tell you something. Warmth would signal whether they are remorseful, threatened, curious, or conflicted. It would reveal emotional movement, and emotional movement would give you orientation. Sterile calm gives you none. Instead, it creates a fog. You can't tell whether you are forgiven, dismissed, or quietly reclassified. You are left reading between lines that no longer exist. This is why your body stays alert. This is why you feel strangely tense even though nothing overt is happening. Your nervous system is responding to inconsistency, the mismatch between calm behavior and emotional absence. Human beings are wired to track relational safety. Warmth signals safety. Its disappearance signals uncertainty, and uncertainty keeps you scanning. That scanning serves a function for them. When warmth disappears, many people instinctively try to restore it. They soften their tone. They become extra agreeable. They reintroduce emotional gestures, hoping to bring the relationship back to a familiar rhythm. But this calm is not waiting for repair. It is testing your tolerance. How much emotional distance will you endure without naming it? How long will you accept civility without connection? At what point will you question yourself rather than the dynamic? This is why sterile calm is so effective. It doesn't provoke resistance. It invites self-doubt. You may find yourself thinking, maybe this is just maturity, or maybe I'm asking for too much, or at least they're not angry anymore. And slowly, and without realizing it, you lower your expectations. That lowering is the real shift, because when warmth disappears and you adapt rather than inquire, the relational standard changes. What once would have felt unacceptable begins to feel normal. Emotional minimalism replaces reciprocity. Presence is replaced by performance. And the most unsettling part is that this calm often looks healthy from the outside. Others may even praise it. At least things are calm now, they might say. At least there's no drama. But drama and depth are not the same thing. Peace without warmth is not peace. It is neutrality enforced by control. This is where many people lose clarity because the mind wants to believe that calm equals safety. But your experience tells a different story. You don't feel safer, you feel smaller, less seen, and less certain of where you stand. That is not coincidence. Sterile calm allows the narcissistic personality to remain in the interaction without engaging emotionally. They can observe, assess, and wait, without revealing anything about their internal state. They appear composed while you feel increasingly unanchored, and that imbalance matters. Because when one person withholds emotional presence while maintaining relational access, power concentrates. The relationship stops being mutual and starts being asymmetrical. You begin to carry the emotional weight alone. This is also why the absence of warmth often comes with a subtle shift in tone. Conversations feel more formal. Responses feel delayed or minimal. There is a sense of being evaluated rather than understood. You are no longer being related to, you are being handled. And handling requires distance. It's important to say this clearly. The absence of warmth is not proof that you did something wrong. It is not evidence that your needs are unreasonable. It is not a sign that emotional depth is no longer appropriate. It is a sign that emotional depth is being avoided. Because depth would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would require responsibility, and responsibility would threaten the internal narrative they are trying to preserve. So calm becomes sterile. What makes this stage particularly dangerous is that it invites endurance rather than response. You don't feel justified in confronting it, because nothing is explicitly wrong. There are no harsh words, no obvious cruelty, just a quiet emotional withdrawal masked as composure. And if you're someone who values harmony, you may endure this longer than you should. You may tell yourself that patience is virtuous, that giving space is respectful, that demanding warmth is selfish. But here is the truth that cuts through the confusion. Real calm does not require you to abandon yourself. Real calm does not make you question your perceptions. Real calm does not drain you of vitality. Real calm does not feel empty. When warmth disappears and calm remains, the calm is not the achievement. It is the cover. And recognizing that is not about escalating or accusing. It is about orientation. It is about trusting what your body and intuition are registering. Because the absence of warmth is not neutral information. It is a signal that something unresolved is being managed rather than addressed. A signal that emotional presence has been withdrawn. Not for healing, but for protection. A signal that the relationship is entering a phase where control is prioritized over connection. When you understand this, you stop trying to earn warmth back. You stop performing stability to keep the peace. You stop mistaking emotional absence for maturity. And that clarity, quiet, grounded, and unreactive, changes what happens next. Because sterile calm can only function when you accept less than what a real connection requires. The moment you stop normalizing emotional absence, the calm is exposed for what it is, not peace, but preparation. How quiet revenge is born. Why narcissistic retaliation is rarely explosive. When people imagine revenge, they picture intensity, raised voices, sudden cruelty, a dramatic turning point that announces itself unmistakably. They expect retaliation to arrive loud, emotional, and unmistakable. But in narcissistic dynamics, revenge almost never looks like that. It arrives quietly. So quietly, in fact, that many people don't recognize it until long after it has begun shaping their reality. This is because narcissistic revenge is not driven by impulse. It is driven by preservation. To understand how quiet revenge is born, you have to understand what was injured. Not pride in the casual sense, not ego in the everyday sense. What was threatened was structure. The internal architecture that allows them to feel coherent, superior, justified, and safe. When you stopped playing your old role, when confrontation no longer produced submission or reassurance, something fractured internally. But that fracture could not be acknowledged. To acknowledge it would mean admitting vulnerability, dependency, or limitation. Experiences that feel annihilating rather than humbling. So the injury had to be managed, and the first rule of managing narcissistic injury is this: never appear wounded. This is why retaliation does not erupt immediately. Rage would reveal pain. Hostility would signal loss of control. Emotional outbursts would expose the very weakness they are trying to deny. Instead, they wait. The silence, the sterile calm, the observation. These are not neutral phases. They are incubation. This is where injured pride is transformed into something far more dangerous than anger. It becomes conviction. Inside this quiet space, a story begins to form. A narrative that allows them to make sense of what happened without accepting responsibility. The facts are reorganized. The emotional timeline is edited. Your boundary is reframed not as self-respect but as attack. Your clarity becomes cruelty. Your autonomy becomes betrayal. And crucially, they are no longer just hurt. They are right. This is the psychological pivot where revenge stops feeling like retaliation and starts feeling like justice. Once that moral frame locks into place, restraint no longer feels necessary. Harm no longer feels cruel. It feels corrective. But because their self-image depends on appearing reasonable, the revenge cannot be messy. It must be clean, rational, sanitized, ideally invisible. This is why narcissistic revenge is delayed. Time allows emotion to cool while resentment hardens. Time allows the narrative to stabilize. Time allows them to appear calm while privately preparing to restore dominance. And dominance in this context does not require confrontation. It requires outcome. Quiet revenge is about regaining the upper hand without ever looking aggressive. It is about winning without being seen as someone who needed to win. That is why the actions that follow often feel disproportionate, indirect, or confusing. The punishment does not match the offense because the offense is not what is being addressed. What is being addressed is the injury to their internal hierarchy. Revenge becomes a way to correct that imbalance. What makes this especially unsettling is that the narcissistic personality often believes their own narrative. This is not calculated villainy in the way people imagine it. It is self-deception in service of self-preservation. Admitting malicious intent would fracture the identity they are protecting. So instead, they convince themselves they are being fair. They may think they are setting boundaries. They may think they are standing up for themselves. They may think they are simply responding to your behavior. But beneath that justification is a quieter truth. They are trying to reassert control without ever appearing controlling. This is why quiet revenge often takes subtle forms. Social shifts, narrative changes, withholding support, strategic distance, actions that are deniable on the surface but destabilizing in effect. And because there is no obvious attack, you are left disoriented. You sense something has changed, but you can't point to a single moment or behavior that clearly explains it. In that ambiguity is not a flaw in the strategy, it is the strategy. Ambiguity protects them from accountability. Another crucial aspect of quiet revenge is timing. It rarely happens while emotions are raw. It begins when you are recovering. When you've lowered your guard, when you've started to believe that the worst is over. This delay gives the impression that whatever comes next is unrelated to the conflict. It feels coincidental, natural, unconnected, and that makes it harder to challenge. You might think, if this were revenge, it would have happened sooner. But narcissistic revenge is not about release. It is about leverage. It waits for the moment when defenses are down and access is possible, emotionally, socially, or practically. Because revenge that cannot be traced is revenge that cannot be confronted. What is also important to understand is that quiet revenge is rarely motivated by hatred. It is motivated by fear. Fear of irrelevance, fear of losing position, fear of being seen as powerless or replaceable. When you step out of orbit and begin to orient around your own values, that fear intensifies. And fear, when filtered through narcissistic psychology, does not produce vulnerability. It produces control-seeking behavior. This is why the retaliation may feel strangely impersonal, as if it's not about your shared history or emotional reality at all. Because at this stage, it isn't. You are no longer being engaged with as a person, you are being managed as a problem. And problems in their mind require solutions. This is where many people make another critical mistake. They underestimate what is happening because it feels calm. And they assume that if something truly malicious were forming, it would feel louder, more dramatic, more obvious. But the most damaging actions often arrive without emotional heat. They arrive justified. Quiet revenge is not explosive because explosions draw attention. They force investigation. They invite scrutiny. Quiet revenge erodes instead. It shifts perception. It alters context. It changes how others relate to you. It creates consequences without fingerprints. And by the time you recognize the pattern, the narrative has already been seeded. The ground has already shifted. This is why understanding this phase matters so deeply. Not so you can become paranoid, not so you can retaliate, but so you don't mislabel patience as peace or restraint as safety. When revenge is quiet, it relies on your assumption of good faith, and it relies on your hope that things have stabilized. It relies on your belief that calm means closure. Once you see that revenge does not need rage to exist, you stop waiting for emotional cues to protect yourself. You begin paying attention to structure instead, changes in behavior, shifts in tone, alterations in access and influence. And that awareness changes how much power quiet revenge can actually have. Because narcissistic retaliation depends on being misunderstood. It needs you to believe nothing is happening while something is being prepared. It needs your confusion more than your fear. When you stop underestimating silence, when you stop assuming that calm equals harmlessness, you are no longer easy to outmaneuver. And that is often when the strategy must evolve again. Because quiet revenge, like all control-based tactics, it only works when it remains unseen. Once it is recognized for what it is, not anger, not justice, but injury trying to restore hierarchy, it loses much of its force. And that recognition does not require confrontation. It requires clarity. And clarity is the one thing quiet revenge cannot tolerate for long. From power struggles to story control, why the battle moves underground. When overt power struggles stop working, the conflict does not end. It relocates. Up to this point, everything has happened in the open. Tension, silence, distance, subtle shifts in tone. All of it still existed within the relational space between you and them. Even when they withdrew, the dynamic was personal, direct, and contained within the relationship itself. But there comes a moment when that arena becomes too dangerous for them. Indirect engagement now carries risk. Every interaction could reveal insecurity. Every conversation could expose contradiction. Every emotional exchange could confirm what you are beginning to see clearly. So the battleground changes. Power no longer flows through interaction. It flows through perception. This is the moment when control moves underground. Instead of trying to dominate the relationship directly, the narcissistic personality begins to manage the story around it. And this shift is not emotional, it is psychological, strategic, deliberate, because while confrontation threatens their image, narrative control restores it. Stories are safer than arguments. Stories can be shaped quietly. They can be adjusted depending on the audience. They can travel without you ever being present to challenge them. And once a story takes hold, it does far more damage than any argument ever could. This is why the battle leaves the open field and enters the social world. What makes this phase so effective is that it doesn't look like attack. There are no accusations, no public confrontations, no obvious hostility. Instead, it arrives wrapped in concern, restraint, and reasonableness. A sigh at the right moment, a carefully chosen sentence, a calm tone when your name comes up. They might say things like, "I'm just worried about them," or "I don't think they're doing very well lately," or "I really tried to make things work." None of these statements are overt lies. That's why they're so powerful. They are incomplete truths framed to guide perception. And because they are delivered calmly, they feel reflective rather than reactive, mature rather than defensive. The timing matters. And this doesn't happen during the conflict when emotions are high and motives are suspect. It happens later when things appear settled. That delay gives the story legitimacy. People assume that anything said after emotions cool must be thoughtful. They assume the speaker has processed things. That assumption is exactly what allows the narrative to take root. What's crucial to understand here is that this is not venting. It's not processing pain. It's impression management. The narcissistic personality understands something fundamental about human psychology. People don't assess truth by collecting all the facts. They assess it by coherence, by tone, by who seems calm, reasonable, and morally grounded. And they are very good at sounding calm and morally grounded, so instead of trying to control you, they begin controlling how others see you. This is where many people underestimate what's happening. They assume that because nothing dramatic is being said, nothing significant is occurring. They trust that people who know them will see through it. That truth will eventually assert itself, but social perception doesn't work that way. Stories don't need to be complete to be believed. They need to feel plausible. And a narrative that positions someone as patient and concerned while subtly implying that another person is unstable or difficult, feels very plausible, especially when delivered without malice. Another important element of this phase is selectivity. They do not tell the story to everyone. That would be risky. Instead, they seed it strategically to people whose opinions matter, to people who may later serve as witnesses, invalidators, or buffers. Each version of the story is adjusted slightly depending on the listener, not because they are consciously lying, but because they are managing impressions. What matters is not accuracy, it's alignment, and alignment creates power. Meanwhile, you are still operating under a very different assumption. You believe the conflict was private. You think the relationship exists in good faith. You are focused on moving forward, not defending yourself against something you don't even know is happening. So when subtle changes start to occur, they catch you off guard. A friend seems distant. A colleague responds differently. You no longer receive the benefit of the doubt. Nothing is explicit enough to confront. There is no accusation to answer, just a gradual shift in how you are perceived, and confusion is a weak position to defend from. This is one of the cruelest aspects of narrative control. The more honest and straightforward you are, the more disoriented you become. You replay conversations in your mind, wondering what you said that could have been misunderstood. You assume the issue must be internal because nothing external has been clearly stated. While you are doing that, the story is solidifying. What makes this even more unsettling is that the narcissistic personality often believes their own version of events, or at least enough of it to deliver it convincingly. Admitting that they are acting out of revenge would fracture their self-image. So the narrative becomes moralized. You weren't just assertive, you were harmful. You weren't just setting boundaries, you were cruel. You weren't just stepping back, yet you were abandoning them. Once that moral framing is in place, everything that follows feels justified. Withdrawal becomes self-respect. Exclusion becomes protection. Retaliation becomes consequence. And because the story was introduced gently, people rarely feel manipulated, they feel informed. That's the power of underground control. It doesn't coerce, it persuades. You may feel tempted at this stage to correct the record, to explain yourself, to defend your intentions. But that impulse often plays directly into the strategy, because the moment you react emotionally, the narrative tightens. Your defense becomes evidence. Your confusion becomes instability. Your pain becomes proof. And the story continues to spread, not loudly but steadily. What's especially effective about this approach is its ambiguity. They don't claim certainty, one they imply concern. They don't declare you bad. They suggest you're struggling. And that suggestion gives others permission to reinterpret your behavior retroactively. Past disagreements become patterns. Neutral moments become red flags. Your complexity collapses into a simplified version that fits the story. And suddenly, you are no longer dealing with one person's grievance. You are dealing with a perception that has taken on social weight. This is why the battle moves underground. Because controlling the narrative allows them to achieve what direct power struggles no longer can. Influence without confrontation. Dominance without exposure, retaliation without appearing retaliatory. Understanding this doesn't mean you need to counterattack. It doesn't mean you need to explain yourself to everyone. And it means you stop assuming that silence equals safety and calm equals closure. You recognize that when power can't be maintained through direct control, it is often preserved through story. And once you see that clearly, you stop fighting battles you were never meant to win. Because the goal is not to out-narrate someone committed to distortion. The goal is to remain grounded in reality long enough for false stories to collapse under their own weight. Narratives built on omission and implication require constant maintenance. They cannot survive clarity forever. And the moment you stop participating in the underground war, by staying consistent, composed, and anchored in your own values, the strategy begins to lose traction. And because control through story only works when you are still trying to be understood by people who have already chosen coherence over truth. And that realization quietly changes everything that comes next. Rewriting the narrative without attacking you, how they flip the roles. Quietly, once control has moved underground, the most consequential shift begins, not in behavior but in meaning. This is the phase where many people feel something slipping away without being able to name what it is. Nothing dramatic happens. No accusations are made. No direct attacks occur. And yet, when you look around, the atmosphere has changed. The emotional weather of the room feels different. Conversations feel tilted. Assumptions have quietly rearranged themselves. This is not coincidence. This is the narrative rewrite. What makes this stage so effective is precisely what makes it hard to detect. The narcissistic personality does not need to attack you to damage your position. In fact, attacking you would be counterproductive. Aggression invites scrutiny, it forces sides, it raises questions. Instead, they do something far subtler. They let others draw conclusions. The role reversal begins with tone, not content, a soft voice, a measured pace, a posture of restraint. When your name comes up, it's not paired with anger but with concern, not judgment but worry, not blame but disappointment carefully wrapped in reasonableness. They say things like, "I don't want to speak badly about them," or "I'm really trying to understand what's going on with them," or "They've been under a lot of pressure lately." On the surface, these statements sound compassionate, even generous. And that's exactly why they work, because embedded within that concern is a quiet inversion of roles. You are no longer the person who set a boundary. You are the person who is struggling. You are no longer the one seeking clarity. You are the one who is unstable, overwhelmed, or difficult. And they are no longer the one who avoided accountability. They are the patient one, the reflective one, the one who tried. What's crucial to understand here is that this reversal does not require lies. It requires selection. Certain details are emphasized, others are omitted, context is removed, motives are implied rather than stated. The result is not a false story in the obvious sense, but a curated one. And curated stories feel honest. This is why people rarely question them. There is no cruelty to push back against, no hostility to defend you from. Just a calm, concerned narrative that invites empathy without demanding judgment. People don't feel manipulated, they feel informed. Another reason this tactic is so powerful is that it exploits social norms. Most people want to be fair, they want to avoid conflict, they want to assume good intentions. When someone speaks gently and avoids overt blame, listeners often relax their critical faculties. They assume maturity, and maturity is persuasive. Timing plays a critical role here. This narrative rewrite does not happen while emotions are raw. It begins after the conflict has cooled, after silence has settled, after you have stopped actively defending yourself because you believe there is nothing left to defend. That delay gives the story weight. It feels reflective rather than reactive, and thoughtful rather than emotional. And because you are no longer visibly engaged in conflict, you are not present to correct it in real time. This is where many conscientious people make a fatal assumption. They believe that truth by itself is sufficient, that anyone who knows them will see through the distortion, that relationships are resilient enough to withstand private disagreements. In healthy systems, that is often true. But this is not a healthy system. This is perception management. People do not form opinions based on complete information. They form them based on coherence. Who sounds calm? Who sounds reasonable? Who appears emotionally regulated? And at this stage, the narcissistic personality is very careful to sound all three. Meanwhile, you may be quieter, less certain, more introspective. You are processing internally, not campaigning socially, and that contrast matters, because the person who speaks first and calmly often defines the frame. What makes this particularly destabilizing is that the narrative is rarely broadcast widely. It is seeded strategically to people who matter to you, to people whose opinions carry weight, to people who might later serve as validators or buffers. Each listener receives a slightly different version, calibrated to their values. To one person, the emphasis is concern. To another, it's exhaustion. To another, disappointment. The core message remains the same, but the delivery adapts. This is not random, it is impression management. And while this is happening, you are often completely unaware, or you sense something is off but dismiss it. You assume adults will reserve judgment. You believe silence equals neutrality. But silence in this context is not neutral. It allows the story to harden without resistance. Over time, you may notice subtle consequences. People hesitate before responding to you. Invitations feel cooler. You no longer receive the benefit of the doubt. When misunderstandings arise, you feel slightly outnumbered, even though no one has openly accused you of anything. This is one of the cruel ironies of this stage. The more honest and internally focused you are, the more disoriented you become. You replay conversations wondering what you said that could have been misunderstood. You assume the issue must be internal because nothing external has been named. And while you are doing that, the rewritten version of you becomes socially real. What makes this even more unsettling is that the narcissistic personality often believes the narrative themselves, or at least enough of it to deliver it convincingly. Admitting that they are reshaping the story out of retaliation would fracture their self-image. So the story becomes moralized. You weren't just assertive, you were hurtful. You weren't just stepping back, you were abandoning them. You weren't just setting limits, you were being cold. Once that moral frame locks into place, the emotional tone shifts again. They speak about you less frequently, but when they do, it carries a quiet finality. As if conclusions have already been drawn. As if your character has been assessed and found wanting. And that tone, calm, distant, quietly judgmental, is often more damaging than open hostility. Because it invites agreement without demanding it. Others can align with it without feeling aggressive. At this point, many people feel an urge to correct the record, to explain their intentions, to defend their character. That impulse is understandable. But it often backfires, because the moment you react emotionally, the narrative tightens. Your defense becomes evidence. Your distress becomes confirmation. The story doesn't need to be proven, it only needs to be reinforced. This is how roles are flipped without a single attack. You are no longer responding to a disagreement, you are responding to a perception. And perceptions once formed are resistant to correction, especially when they serve someone's sense of moral coherence. Understanding this stage is not about becoming cynical or defensive. It is about clarity, about recognizing that not all harm comes from overt aggression. Some of it comes from quiet repositioning. When someone can no longer control you directly, they may attempt to control how others see you. And when you see that clearly, you stop chasing understanding from people who have already been guided toward a conclusion. Because the goal here is not to win the story. It is to remain anchored in reality while the story runs its course. Narratives built on omission and implication require constant reinforcement. They collapse when faced with consistency over time. And consistency, quiet, grounded, and non-reactive, is something you can offer without ever explaining yourself. That is the quiet counter to a quiet strategy, not confrontation, not defense, but clarity that does not bend to distortion. And once you stop participating in the role reversal by refusing to argue against a story you didn't write, the power of that narrative begins, slowly, to erode. Timing as a psychological weapon. Why the story comes later, not during the fight. One of the most misunderstood aspects of narcissistic retaliation is not what is done, but when it is done. People expect the story to emerge during the conflict itself. They assume that if someone is going to distort events, accuse or position themselves as the victim, it will happen in the heat of the moment, when emotions are high and defenses are visible. That expectation feels logical. It fits how most honest disagreements unfold. But narcissistic psychology does not operate on emotional release. It operates on advantage, and advantage is never pursued at the loudest moment. And this is why the most damaging narratives rarely appear during the fight. They appear later, quietly, after the dust has settled, after you've stopped defending yourself, after you've begun to believe that the conflict is over. Timing in this context is not incidental. It is the weapon. During the confrontation itself, the narcissistic personality is constrained. Emotions are raw. Stakes are obvious. Anything said can be scrutinized. If they attack too openly, they risk appearing reactive, unstable, or cruel. If they rewrite the story too quickly, it looks defensive. If they recruit sympathy too soon, it raises suspicion. So they don't. They wait. Waiting serves several psychological functions at once. First, it allows them to regain internal composure, not reflection, control. The initial shock of being challenged needs to be contained, and the injured self-image must be stabilized before it can be defended. Second, time allows them to revise the narrative without emotional leakage. When enough distance has passed, their tone becomes calm, measured, even thoughtful. What they say later sounds considered rather than impulsive. And that difference in tone changes everything. People trust narratives that sound reflective. They assume that anything said after emotions cool must be closer to the truth. That assumption is deeply ingrained, and it is exactly what makes delayed storytelling so effective. But there is a third, more subtle function of timing, one that directly affects you. Delay disarms you. When nothing happens immediately after the conflict, your nervous system begins to relax. You start to believe that the danger has passed. You shift your attention back to your own life. You stop preparing explanations. You stop replaying conversations. You lower your guard. The lowering is not weakness, it is human, and it creates the perfect conditions for the story to take hold. When the narrative emerges later, weeks or even months after the confrontation, it feels disconnected. It doesn't register as retaliation. It feels like a separate development, a reinterpretation, a conclusion reached with distance and maturity. You might think, if this were about the conflict, it would have come up sooner. That assumption is precisely what allows the strategy to work. Timing also gives the narcissistic personality another advantage: context control. During the fight, the full complexity of the interaction is still alive. There are details, nuance, contradictions. The emotional reality is fresh, but with time, complexity fades, memory simplifies. People remember impressions more than specifics. This is where narrative power increases. A story introduced later does not have to compete with vivid recollection. It only has to sound coherent. And coherence, not accuracy, is what most people respond to. What's especially destabilizing is that this delayed story often aligns with social expectations. It sounds like growth, like perspective, like someone who took time to think before speaking. I didn't want to say anything while emotions were high. I needed space to process. I've reflected a lot on what happened. These phrases signal maturity. They create credibility before content is even evaluated. And by the time the story is shared, it is framed not as reaction but as insight. Meanwhile, you are no longer oriented toward defense. You are oriented toward healing or moving on. You are not expecting to be redefined. You assume the issue is behind you. That asymmetry is critical. You are facing forward. They are revising backward. And because you are not present when the story is introduced, because you are not actively engaged in the conflict anymore, you lose the chance to shape the frame. This is why delayed narratives feel so disorienting. You don't experience them as accusations. You experience them as shifts in atmosphere. People respond differently. Assumptions have changed. You sense judgment, but you can't locate its source. There is no clear moment to object. Timing also protects the narcissistic personality from accountability. If you try to address the narrative later, it feels like reopening old wounds. You risk appearing obsessed, defensive, or unable to let things go. And that risk is not accidental. Delayed storytelling puts you in a bind. Speak up and confirm the narrative of instability, or stay silent and allow the story to stand. This is one of the quietest forms of control. No force is applied, no confrontation is required. The situation organizes itself around your reluctance to escalate something that appears settled. Another reason the story comes later is internal coherence. The narcissistic personality needs time to fully believe their own version. Immediate distortion is harder to internalize. But a story repeated privately, adjusted over time, and reinforced through selective validation begins to feel true. And once it feels true to them, it can be delivered with conviction. That conviction is persuasive, not because it is accurate, but because it is emotionally settled. People confuse emotional certainty with honesty all the time, and certainty that arrives calmly feels especially trustworthy. What is rarely acknowledged is how intentional this delay is. This is not procrastination, it is sequencing. First comes silence to reset the emotional field, then distance to regain composure, then narrative to restore hierarchy. Each phase prepares the ground for the next. By the time the story emerges, it does not feel like retaliation, it feels like resolution. A conclusion reached after careful thought, and that is what makes it so difficult to counter. Understanding this changes how you interpret what is happening around you. You stop asking why nothing was said earlier. You stop assuming that delay equals neutrality. You recognize that timing itself is part of the strategy. This does not mean you should confront every rumor or defend yourself preemptively. That often deepens the trap. It means you stop measuring safety by silence and closure by calm. You begin paying attention to sequence. When a narrative appears long after a conflict, especially one that subtly repositions you, it is rarely accidental. It is the final phase of a process that began the moment you stopped playing your old role. And once you see that clearly, the confusion lifts. You realize that the delay was not kindness. It was preparation, not for understanding, but for advantage. That awareness does not require reaction. It requires restraint. It allows you to stop chasing resolution in spaces where the outcome has already been decided. And because the most important thing to understand about timing as a psychological weapon is this: it only works when you believe the story is emerging naturally. The moment you recognize it as strategic, its power diminishes. And that recognition quietly changes how the rest of the story unfolds. Why truth alone doesn't protect you, how social perception really works. One of the most painful realizations in this entire process is also one of the hardest to accept. Being truthful is not the same as being protected. Most conscientious people are raised with a quiet moral assumption that honesty carries its own defense, that if you speak clearly, act with integrity, and avoid manipulation, the truth will eventually surface and correct any misunderstanding. That assumption feels not only reasonable but ethical, and it is how healthy systems are supposed to work. But when narcissistic dynamics enter the social arena, that assumption becomes a liability. Because social perception does not operate on truth alone. It operates on coherence, confidence, and emotional framing. And this is where many people are caught off guard. You may be telling the truth. You may be grounded in reality. You may even have facts on your side. And still, the story that spreads about you carries more weight than the reality you lived. Not because people are evil, but because that is how human perception works. Most people do not investigate character the way a court investigates evidence. They do not gather competing accounts and weigh them carefully. They rely on shortcuts, tone, timing, consistency. Who seems calm? Who sounds reasonable? Who appears emotionally stable? And in the aftermath of narcissistic conflict, those signals are often stacked against you. You are quieter because you are processing. They are calmer because they are performing. You hesitate because you don't want to escalate. They speak because they want to define the frame. That contrast matters far more than most people realize. Truth requires context. It requires patience. It requires a willingness to sit with complexity. But social environments, families, workplaces, friend groups, are not built for complexity. They are built for efficiency, for harmony, for narratives that reduce discomfort quickly. This is why the person who offers the simplest, most emotionally coherent story often wins the room. And narcissistic personalities are very good at offering exactly that. Their version does not need to be detailed, and it only needs to feel complete. It does not need to be accurate. It only needs to sound settled. When someone speaks with calm certainty, listeners unconsciously interpret that as credibility. Meanwhile, your truth may be messier. It may include nuance, mixed emotions, or unresolved questions. You may even acknowledge your own mistakes. Ironically, that honesty can make your account sound less convincing in environments that prioritize clarity over depth. So the truth, while real, struggles to compete. This is where many people feel betrayed by reality itself. They think, if people really knew me, they would understand. And in intimate, emotionally mature relationships, that is often true. But in broader social systems, perception does not wait for full understanding. It forms quickly, then resists revision. Once a narrative has been introduced, especially one that positions someone as calm, reflective, and morally centered, it becomes the reference point through which new information is interpreted. Anything you say afterward is filtered through that lens. If you explain yourself, you seem defensive. If you stay quiet, you seem evasive. If you show emotion, you seem unstable. If you remain composed, you seem distant. This is not because you are doing something wrong. It is because the frame has already been set. And frames are powerful. Another reason truth alone doesn't protect you is that narcissistic narratives are rarely extreme. They do not paint you as a villain outright. That would invite skepticism. Instead, they position you as struggling, and overwhelmed, so reactive, none are hard to deal with. These are soft judgments. And soft judgments are dangerous. They don't provoke defense. They invite interpretation. People begin filling in the gaps themselves. Past interactions are reinterpreted. Neutral moments are retroactively reframed as warning signs. And because the narrative is subtle, people rarely feel complicit. They feel observant. This is where you may start to feel socially displaced without understanding why. You haven't been accused of anything. No one has confronted you. But the emotional temperature around you has changed. Trust feels thinner. Support feels conditional. And the more you try to understand it, the more confusing it becomes. This is the cruel paradox. Honesty does not automatically counter distortion when distortion is delivered calmly and indirectly. In fact, reacting to it too directly can strengthen it. And because the narcissistic narrative does not need to be proven, it only needs to be consistent. And consistency over time outweighs truth in many social contexts. This is not because people don't care about truth. It's because truth requires effort. And most people are not equipped or willing to hold competing realities at once. They gravitate toward the version that feels emotionally settled. What makes this even more destabilizing is that your values may work against you. If you value fairness, you hesitate to speak badly about someone else. If you value privacy, you avoid sharing details. If you value peace, you avoid clarifying things that might stir conflict. Each of those choices is ethical, and each of them creates space for the other story to dominate. This is why relying on truth alone can leave you exposed. Not because truth is weak, but because it is not self-promoting. It does not campaign. It does not simplify itself for convenience. It waits to be sought. And in these dynamics, it rarely is. Understanding this does not mean you abandon integrity. It does not mean you start manipulating perception in return. It means you stop assuming that silence will be interpreted as neutrality or that goodness will speak for itself. You begin to recognize that social reality is shaped by what is repeated, not just what is real. This realization can be deeply unsettling. It can feel like a loss of moral ground, like the rules you lived by no longer apply. But there is another way to understand it, one that restores agency rather than eroding it. Truth may not protect you immediately, but consistency does. Over time, people notice patterns, and they notice who remains steady and who requires constant narrative reinforcement. They notice who behaves predictably across situations and who needs context to justify behavior. They notice who escalates quietly and who remains grounded. False stories require maintenance. They need to be refreshed, adjusted, defended. Truth does not. It simply exists. This is why the most effective response to distorted perception is not frantic correction. It is not counter-narrative warfare. It is not explaining yourself to people who have already chosen coherence over complexity. It is living in a way that does not need translation. That doesn't mean everyone will understand you. Some won't. Some prefer simple stories. Some are more comfortable aligning with the calm voice than questioning it. But those alignments are fragile, even because systems built on distortion collapse under sustained clarity. When you understand that truth alone is not armor, you stop expecting immediate justice from social spaces that were never designed to deliver it. You stop internalizing misperception as failure. You stop trying to earn understanding from people who are invested in ease rather than accuracy. And that shift is quietly powerful. Because once you stop needing the truth to rescue you, you begin to stand in it without explanation. And over time, that steadiness speaks louder than any story ever could. Indifference. That isn't real when distance turns into surveillance. At some point in this process, something strange begins to happen. After the silence, after the narrative shifts, after the emotional temperature drops, you notice what looks like indifference, and they seem detached, unbothered, as if you no longer matter enough to engage with. From the outside, it looks like disengagement. From the inside, it feels like abandonment. But this is where many people misread the situation in a way that costs them clarity. Because in narcissistic dynamics, distance rarely means disinterest. It means repositioning. What you are witnessing is not withdrawal from relevance, but withdrawal from visibility. They stop asking questions not because they don't care, but because asking would reveal interest, and interest would give you leverage. So instead, they watch, quietly, indirectly, persistently. This is the phase where indifference becomes a mask, and attention goes underground. They no longer initiate contact. They don't react publicly. They don't comment on your life the way they used to. And that absence creates a powerful illusion that they have moved on. But underneath that apparent detachment, their attention sharpens. Because for someone whose sense of self depends on dominance and validation, losing direct access to you creates an intolerable uncertainty. They no longer know where they stand in your internal world. They don't know if they still matter, if they've been replaced, or if their influence has diminished. And that not knowing is experienced not as curiosity but as threat. So they begin to monitor, not openly, not directly. That would expose intent. Instead, they gather information through the environment, through mutual connections, through casual remarks, through digital traces, through moments that feel coincidental but aren't. You may notice that they know things you didn't tell them, and they reference changes in your life you didn't share. They seem to appear emotionally or socially just as you begin to stabilize or move forward. And when you try to make sense of it, you hesitate. After all, they said they were done. They acted indifferent. Why would they still be watching? Because indifference is the performance. Control is the motive. This kind of surveillance serves several psychological functions at once. First, it restores a sense of power. Even if they can no longer influence you directly, knowing where you are emotionally allows them to feel one step ahead. Information reduces uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty reduces anxiety. Second, it provides material. Information in this context is not neutral. It is potential leverage. Your vulnerabilities, your successes, your relationships, your moments of weakness or confidence. All of it becomes data. Data that can be used later, reshaped into narrative or deployed strategically if needed. What makes this especially destabilizing is how often this monitoring is disguised as concern or coincidence. A mutual acquaintance asks an oddly specific question. Someone references something you shared privately. A message arrives at precisely the moment you seem to be regaining equilibrium. None of it is overt enough to confront. And that ambiguity is intentional, because ambiguity keeps you guessing, and guessing drains energy. Meanwhile, they maintain the appearance of distance. They don't reach out. They don't explain themselves. They don't show jealousy or anger. That contrast, the absence of visible emotion paired with uncanny awareness, creates cognitive dissonance. You start doubting your perceptions. You tell yourself you're imagining things, that you're being paranoid, that if they really cared, they would say something. That self-doubt is not incidental. It is one of the most effective outcomes of covert surveillance. When you don't trust your instincts, you hesitate to set firmer boundaries. You second-guess your interpretations. You delay action, and delay preserves access. This monitoring also allows them to test you without revealing themselves. They may drop subtle references, post something they know you'll see, make small changes designed to provoke a reaction, and then they watch. Do you respond? Do you pull back? Do you become anxious? Do you pretend not to notice? Each response feeds the internal model they're building of you. What still works? What no longer does? What might be effective later? This is the moment when the relationship stops being relational. You are no longer being engaged with as a person. You are being tracked as a variable. And once someone relates to you as a variable rather than a human being, empathy drops out of the equation almost entirely. What remains is utility. What matters is not how you feel, but how you move. This is why their interest in your life can spike precisely when you're doing better. Your growth represents loss of control. Your happiness without them feels like erasure, and erasure for someone built on external validation is annihilation. So they watch for signs of independence, of confidence, of forward movement. Not to celebrate them, but to assess whether intervention is required. This is another place where people misinterpret what's happening. And they assume that if someone were still invested, they would reach out. But reaching out would expose vulnerability. Watching does not. Watching preserves superiority. It allows them to remain psychologically involved without being seen. And being unseen is safety. What's particularly damaging is how this surveillance can seep into your internal world. You begin to self-edit. You hesitate before sharing good news. You feel a vague sense of being observed even when nothing concrete is happening. That internalized presence, The sense that someone is tracking you is often more controlling than direct interference, because it colonizes your attention. And attention is the final territory of control. This phase can last a long time, weeks, months, sometimes longer, because patience here is not restraint, it is investment, and they are waiting for the right moment. The moment when you are open, distracted, or vulnerable enough that a small move will have disproportionate impact. Understanding this is crucial. Not so you become fearful, but so you stop underestimating what distance paired with excessive awareness actually means. Indifference that comes with ignorance is benign. Indifference that comes with knowledge is not. When someone pretends not to care while tracking your every move, the pretense is the lie. The attention tells the truth. And here is the quiet reversal that happens when you recognize this dynamic. You stop feeding the information loop. You become more deliberate about what you share and with whom. You stop performing your life for an unseen audience, because surveillance collapses when there is nothing to observe. And this does not require confrontation. It requires containment. It requires you to reclaim your attention and stop leaking your inner world into spaces that do not deserve access. When you do that, something important shifts. The monitoring loses value, the data dries up, the sense of control they were trying to restore weakens. And without information, the illusion of superiority fades. Indifference that isn't real depends on your belief in it. The moment you see distance not as disengagement, but as strategy, the spell breaks. You stop mistaking quiet for absence. And you begin to understand that the most revealing thing is not that they stepped back. It's that they never truly left. How they know more than they should. Information is ammunition. There is a moment in this process that feels quietly disturbing, even before you can explain why. It's not dramatic. No lines are crossed overtly. No accusations are made. And yet, something doesn't add up. They know things you never told them, a change in your plans, a shift in your emotional life, a decision you made privately, shared only with a small circle. They reference it casually, almost offhandedly, as if it's common knowledge. And you're left with a question that lingers long after the conversation ends. How did they know that? This is not coincidence, and it is not intuition. It is information. In narcissistic dynamics, information is never neutral. It is not gathered for connection. It is not held with care. It is not respected as something private or contextual. Information is ammunition. By the time you reach this stage, distance has already been established. Direct engagement has been reduced. Overt conflict has faded. On the surface, they appear removed from your life, detached, indifferent. And yet their awareness of you has not diminished. It has sharpened. This is where many people struggle to trust their perception. They tell themselves they must be imagining things, that it's a small world, that news travels, that mutual connections talk. And yes, sometimes that's true. But what distinguishes this dynamic is not that information exists. It's how it is used. The narcissistic personality does not gather information passively. They collect it strategically, not to understand you, but to locate leverage, not to support you, but to preserve dominance, not to reconnect, but to retain relevance. When direct access to you is lost, indirect access becomes essential. So they listen more than they speak. They ask questions that seem harmless but aren't. They position themselves as concerned, neutral, or uninvolved, roles that invite disclosure from others. People talk more freely to those who appear calm and detached. They assume there is no agenda. And that assumption opens doors. This is how information flows without you ever being present. What makes this especially unsettling is that the information is rarely used immediately. It is stored, cataloged, filed away. Because information is most powerful when deployed selectively. A detail shared at the wrong time looks intrusive. A detail revealed at the right moment looks insightful. Timing turns knowledge into control. You may notice that certain comments arrive precisely when you are regaining stability, just as you feel more grounded. You're more independent, more centered in yourself. A remark is dropped, a reference is made, a subtle reminder that you are still seen. And that reminder lands. Not because it's threatening, but because it's uncanny. It reactivates uncertainty. It brings their psychological presence back into your inner world. It reminds you that distance has not meant disappearance. This is one of the most overlooked aspects of narcissistic retaliation. The goal is not always to act. Often the goal is simply to remain relevant in your mind. Because relevance preserves power. Information also serves another function: narrative reinforcement. Details about your life can be reframed later to support the story already in circulation. Your choices can be interpreted, your struggles can be contextualized, your growth can be minimized or pathologized, and a promotion becomes arrogance, a boundary becomes coldness, a new relationship becomes instability. The facts don't change, the meaning does, and because the information is real, the distortion is harder to challenge. It feels grounded, reasonable, observant. Others don't see manipulation, they see insight. That's the danger of truth used without integrity. Another reason this phase is so destabilizing is that it often happens without your consent or awareness. You didn't choose to share. You didn't offer context. You didn't get to frame your own experience. And yet your life is being discussed, interpreted, and sometimes judged. This creates a sense of exposure that is difficult to articulate. You feel seen but not known, observed but not understood, present in conversations you were never invited into. Even that sense of being tracked can subtly alter your behavior. You begin to self-censor. You hesitate before sharing good news. You question who knows what. This is not paranoia. It is adaptation to an environment where information has been weaponized. Because once you realize that what you share can be repurposed, your nervous system becomes more guarded. You start protecting your inner world not out of secrecy, but out of self-preservation. What's important to understand is that this surveillance is not driven by curiosity. Curiosity seeks understanding. This seeks control. For someone who derives their sense of self from influence and hierarchy, losing direct access to you creates a vacuum. Information fills that vacuum. It allows them to feel involved without being vulnerable, and it restores a sense of orientation without requiring engagement. And because they are no longer relating to you emotionally, empathy does not limit how the information is used. You are no longer a person in this equation. You are a position, a data set, a potential variable in future strategy. This is why it can feel so cold, and this is also why trying to confront it directly rarely helps. Asking, "How did you know that?" often leads nowhere. Denial, deflection, innocent explanations. The ambiguity remains intact. The power is not in proving intent. The power is in recognizing pattern. When someone repeatedly knows more than they should at moments that destabilize rather than connect, it is not care. It is monitoring. And the antidote is not fear, it is containment. And you begin to understand that not everyone deserves access to your inner life. That privacy is not secrecy. That discretion is not dishonesty. That boundaries around information are not cruelty. They are clarity. When you stop feeding the channels through which information travels, the dynamic changes. Not dramatically, quietly. The data stream dries up, the leverage weakens, the sense of omniscience fades, because information only functions as ammunition when it can be obtained and deployed. And here is the most important truth of this stage. Someone who needs to know everything about you in order to feel secure is not connected to you. They are competing with your autonomy. When you see that clearly, you stop trying to explain your life to people who are not invested in your well-being. You stop mistaking attention for care, but you stop confusing awareness with intimacy. And in that shift, something subtle but powerful happens. The weapon loses its target, because information without access, without reaction, without emotional return has no impact. And once information can no longer be used to disturb your center, it ceases to be ammunition at all. It becomes just what it should have been from the beginning. Irrelevant. Strategic kindness. Why warmth after coldness is dangerous. Just when you've adjusted to the distance, just when the silence has settled and your nervous system has begun to recalibrate, something shifts again. The tone softens. A message arrives that feels thoughtful. A compliment appears where there was none before. An offer of help emerges unexpectedly. The emotional temperature rises, not enough to feel suspicious, but enough to feel relieving. And that relief is powerful, because after coldness, warmth feels like progress. It feels like resolution. It feels like proof that patience worked, that restraint paid off, that maybe the tension is finally dissolving. But in narcissistic dynamics, warmth that follows coldness is rarely reconciliation. It is repositioning. To understand why this phase is so dangerous, you have to understand its psychological function. Strategic kindness does not emerge from remorse or empathy. It emerges from calculation. After silence has created uncertainty and surveillance has restored a sense of control, kindness becomes the next lever. Not to heal the relationship, but to reopen access. This is where human decency becomes the entry point. Most people relax in the presence of warmth. We are wired to. Warmth signals safety. It invites trust. It lowers defenses. And when that warmth comes after a period of emotional deprivation, its impact is amplified. It feels earned. You might think, maybe this is the real turning point. You might feel hope stirring again, cautiously but sincerely. You might allow yourself to soften. That softening is the goal. What makes strategic kindness so effective is that it is calibrated. It is never overwhelming. That would feel manipulative. Instead, it arrives subtly. A small gesture, a kind tone, a moment of apparent understanding. Just enough to test the door. They may reference something you said weeks ago as if to show they were listening. They may offer support without being asked. They may even apologize, but carefully, vaguely, without specifics. And that vagueness matters. A real apology requires accountability. It names harm. It acknowledges impact. Strategic kindness requires only tone. It is not about owning the past. It is about shaping the future. The question they are asking in this moment is not, can this be repaired? It is. Is access still available? And they measure the answer through your response. Do you respond quickly? Do you express gratitude? Do you reciprocate emotionally? Do you return to familiar patterns of explanation, reassurance, accommodation? Each of these reactions provides information. When you soften, they learn that distance still draws you in. When you engage warmly, they learn that the boundary you set can be bypassed without being addressed. When you express hope, they learn that the dynamic can be reset without accountability. And once access is restored, leverage follows. And this is why strategic kindness is often followed by subtle invalidation. The warmth does not remain steady. It fluctuates. It recedes if you assert yourself. It cools if you ask for clarity. It sharpens if you stop accommodating. That inconsistency is not accidental. Warmth offered, then withdrawn, creates confusion. Confusion destabilizes, and destabilization breeds dependency. You begin monitoring the emotional weather again, adjusting your behavior to maintain the good moments, questioning yourself when the warmth disappears. The original issue, the boundary, the harm, the imbalance, fades into the background. And that is the point. Strategic kindness also serves another critical function: image repair. By being warm, by reaching out, by appearing generous, they are creating evidence. Evidence they can use later, internally or externally, to justify whatever comes next. I tried. I reached out. I was kind, and it still didn't work. That internal narrative allows them to escalate without guilt. It preserves their self-image as reasonable and well-intentioned, even if the underlying issues remain untouched. What makes this phase especially destabilizing is how humane it feels. You don't guard against kindness the way you guard against aggression. You don't analyze generosity the way you analyze hostility. You interpret warmth through your own values. You think, if I were doing this, it would be because I genuinely wanted to make things right. That assumption is the trap. Because for someone who cannot tolerate losing control, kindness is not an expression of care. It is a method of influence. And it is a way of resetting the emotional board without addressing the truth. Notice how quickly the imbalance returns once you accept the kindness. How the warmth becomes conditional. How the tone shifts when you stop complying. How your autonomy begins to feel like a problem again. This is the tell. Real kindness does not require access. It does not collapse when you maintain boundaries. It does not punish you for being autonomous. Strategic kindness does. It exists only as long as it produces the desired response. The moment it stops working, it disappears. Another subtle danger of this phase is nostalgia. Strategic kindness is often paired with references to better times. Shared memories, emotional cues designed to bypass your rational mind and speak directly to your attachment system. This is not coincidence. Nostalgia weakens discernment. It reactivates hope. It makes you want to believe that what once felt real can be restored without doing the work required to restore it. And while you are reconnecting emotionally, the core dynamic remains unchanged. What's particularly confusing is how warmth can coexist with dismissal. They may be pleasant but still unwilling to truly listen. Generous but still disrespectful of your boundaries. Kind in tone but emotionally unavailable when clarity is needed. That contradiction creates internal tension. You feel cared for and unsettled at the same time. And instead of questioning them, you begin questioning yourself. Am I being ungrateful? Am I overthinking this? Should I just let it go? Those questions mark the return of the old dynamic, not because you are weak, but because you are human. Our strategic kindness exploits hope. And hope, when manipulated, can override hard-earned clarity. This does not mean you should reject all gestures of goodwill or become emotionally closed. It means you evaluate kindness by its structure, not its surface. Does it come with accountability? Does it respect your boundaries? Does it persist when you don't comply? Or does it vanish the moment you assert yourself? Because kindness that costs them nothing but costs you your boundaries is not kindness at all. When someone uses warmth to bypass a conversation they are unwilling to have, that warmth is not a gift. It is a diversion. And diversions are never meant to lead you forward. They are meant to lead you away from clarity, from truth, from the very ground you fought to stand on. So when warmth appears without repair, and when kindness shows up without accountability, pause. Do not rush to interpret it as healing. Observe what changes and what does not. Because the fastest way to lose your footing in this dynamic is to mistake charm for character. And once you see strategic kindness for what it is, not reconciliation but repositioning, you stop being moved by it, not with bitterness, not with cynicism, but with clarity. And clarity is the one thing this strategy cannot survive for long. The compliance test, what they're measuring, when they act nice. When the warmth returns, when the tone softens and the tension seems to dissolve, it's tempting to believe that the danger has passed. You may feel yourself relaxing into the moment, relieved that the emotional standoff appears to be over. But beneath that friendliness, something very specific is happening. You are being tested. This phase is not about kindness for its own sake. It is not about reconciliation or mutual understanding. It is about measurement. The narcissistic personality is no longer asking, "Can I overpower you?" That question has already been answered, at least for now. Instead, they are asking something far more precise. Will you comply without being asked to? This is the compliance test. The kindness you're receiving is not random. It is structured. It appears after distance, after silence, after uncertainty has had time to erode your emotional footing. By the time the warmth arrives, your nervous system is primed for relief. And relief is fertile ground for influence. What they are measuring in this moment is not gratitude, it is responsiveness. Do you soften your stance? Do you re-enter familiar emotional rhythms? And do you begin explaining yourself again, reassuring them, smoothing things over? Do you abandon clarity in favor of comfort? Each reaction answers a question for them. Compliance does not always look like obedience. Often it looks like cooperation, like flexibility, like being the bigger person. And if you value harmony, empathy, and emotional responsibility, those traits are easy to exploit. The test is subtle because it must be. If they demanded compliance openly, you might resist. But when kindness leads the interaction, resistance feels unnecessary, even ungrateful. You don't want to punish good behavior, you don't want to appear rigid or unforgiving, so you adjust. And that adjustment is what they're watching. You might notice that the kindness doesn't require much from them. It doesn't involve real vulnerability, and it doesn't involve accountability. It doesn't require them to sit with discomfort or acknowledge harm. It simply creates an opening. What they want to see is whether you'll walk through it. When you do, the dynamic quietly resets. Not completely, not obviously, but enough. Enough for them to feel that the hierarchy has stabilized. Enough for them to believe that control can be restored without confrontation. This is why the kindness often feels conditional, even if you can't immediately articulate why. The warmth remains as long as you remain accommodating. The moment you reassert yourself by asking a hard question, setting a boundary, or maintaining emotional independence, the temperature drops. That drop is not accidental. It is feedback. You are being trained gently but deliberately to associate compliance with connection and autonomy with withdrawal. And because the withdrawal is subtle, you may not recognize it as punishment. It just feels like the warmth faded, like you did something wrong. So you reflect, you self-correct. You ask yourself whether you were too firm, too distant, too demanding. And once again, the focus shifts away from their behavior and back onto yours. This is the true function of the compliance test, to see whether you will regulate yourself for their comfort. What makes this phase especially dangerous is how reasonable it appears. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. They are being nice. You are responding politely. There is no conflict to point to, no drama to explain. But inside, something has changed. You are no longer relating as equals. You are adjusting to maintain emotional access. And that adjustment, repeated over time, becomes self-erasure. The compliance test also gives them valuable information about your limits. They learn how much autonomy you will sacrifice to preserve peace. How quickly you will compromise when warmth is offered. How far they can go without losing you entirely. This information shapes what comes next. If you comply easily, the kindness may continue temporarily. Long enough to re-establish familiarity. Long enough to draw you back into old patterns. Once that happens, the dynamic resumes its original shape, often with even less tolerance for dissent. If you resist quietly by staying kind but firm, warm but boundaried, the strategy adjusts. The kindness may become intermittent, the tone may cool, Other tactics may be introduced. Either way, the test is not optional, it is diagnostic. And another subtle element of this phase is moral pressure. When someone is being kind, it feels morally uncomfortable to maintain distance. You may feel that holding your boundary now makes you the problem. After all, they're trying. They're being nice. But niceness is not repair. Repair requires acknowledgement. It requires accountability. It requires change that persists even when compliance is not rewarded. Strategic kindness requires none of that. This is why so many people re-enter cycles they worked hard to exit, not because they lack insight, but because they are human. Because kindness activates hope, and hope, when manipulated, can override clarity. What matters here is not whether you accept kindness, it's how you accept it. Do you accept it as a gesture without surrendering your ground? Or do you accept it as proof that the underlying issue no longer matters? The compliance test is passed not by rejecting warmth but by remaining anchored while receiving it. By allowing kindness to exist without letting it erase truth. By responding without resubmitting. This is difficult. It requires emotional discipline. It requires tolerating discomfort, both theirs and yours. It requires resisting the urge to smooth things over prematurely. But it is also where your power quietly consolidates. Because when kindness does not produce compliance, its function is exposed, and once exposed, it loses effectiveness. The narcissistic personality is not measuring your goodness in this moment. They are measuring your availability to be influenced. They are assessing whether the old dynamic can be restored without force. And when the answer is no, when warmth does not override your clarity, the strategy must change. This is often when the tone shifts again, when kindness recedes, when distance returns, or when other forms of pressure emerge. But regardless of what follows, this moment matters, because it is the point at which you stop being managed by emotional cues and start responding from choice. You are no longer asking, how do I keep this calm? You are asking, what does this kindness require of me, and is that cost acceptable? That question changes everything. The compliance test only works when kindness is confused with safety. When you understand that safety does not require self-betrayal, the test loses its power. And once compliance is no longer automatic, the dynamic can no longer proceed as it once did. That is not escalation. It is evolution, in quiet, grounded, and unmistakable. Indirect provocations, emotional testing without leaving evidence. After kindness has done its work, after access has been partially restored and your guard has lowered just enough, the dynamic shifts again. But this time there is no warmth to misinterpret and no overt hostility to confront. What appears instead is something far more elusive. Small disturbances. Moments that feel slightly off but not serious enough to address without sounding unreasonable. Comments that linger in your body longer than they should. Situations that leave you unsettled without giving you a clear reason why. This is not accidental. This is indirect provocation. At this stage, the narcissistic personality understands something crucial. Open attacks create resistance. They invite scrutiny. They force clarity. And clarity is dangerous when control must be maintained without exposure. So instead of confronting you directly, they begin testing you indirectly. These provocations are designed to touch your emotional fault lines while keeping their hands clean. Nothing overt, nothing provable, just enough to destabilize you without leaving evidence. It might come disguised as humor, a sarcastic remark framed as a joke, light enough to deny, sharp enough to sting. Or a casual reference to an old mistake slipped into conversation as if it were harmless nostalgia. Or a comparison that subtly diminishes you while sounding complimentary on the surface. Sometimes it arrives through circumstances rather than words. Plans are changed at the last minute. Boundaries are accidentally crossed. Insensitive information is shared just widely enough to make you uneasy. Invitations feel inconsistent. Responses feel delayed in ways that provoke doubt rather than anger. Each incident on its own seems insignificant. That's the point. Because indirect provocation is not about the event, it is about your reaction. They are not trying to fight you, they are trying to measure you. How sensitive are you now? Where do you still react? How much does it take to unsettle you? Every emotional response becomes data. What makes this tactic so effective is how it exploits your sense of fairness. You hesitate to respond because you can't quite justify doing so. You tell yourself you're overreacting. You wonder whether it's worth bringing up. That hesitation gives them freedom, because as long as you remain uncertain, they retain plausible deniability. If you say something, they act confused. I didn't mean it that way. You're reading too much into it. I was just joking. And suddenly the focus shifts. You are no longer responding to provocation. You are defending your perception. This is not accidental. Once the conversation centers on your reaction rather than their behavior, the power dynamic tilts. You become the unstable variable, and instability in their internal logic justifies whatever comes next. Another important feature of indirect provocations is inconsistency. They don't happen all the time. That would create a pattern. They happen intermittently, just often enough to keep you unsettled, but not often enough to be clearly identified. Unpredictability has a powerful psychological effect. It keeps you vigilant, and it makes you scan interactions for hidden meaning. It exhausts you, and exhaustion lowers resistance. What's especially insidious is how these provocations are often tailored to your values. If you pride yourself on kindness, the jabs are framed as humor. If you value honesty, they imply things rather than saying them outright. If you value peace, they create tension subtle enough that addressing it feels like violating your own principles. They use who you are against you. All the while, they remain outwardly composed, calm, reasonable, even friendly. That contrast between how they appear and how you feel around them leads you inward. You start asking yourself questions you shouldn't have to ask. Why do I feel so unsettled when nothing obvious is wrong? Am I being too sensitive? Maybe this is just my issue. And instead of concluding that something is wrong with the situation, you conclude that something is wrong with you. That self-doubt is the real victory. Because once you no longer trust your emotional responses, you become easier to manage. You delay action. You second-guess boundaries. You tolerate behavior you would have challenged before. And tolerance in this context is interpreted as permission. It's important to understand that these provocations are not the final move. They are rehearsal. Low-risk experiments designed to test what they can get away with. If you react strongly, they retreat temporarily and adjust. If you don't react at all, they escalate slightly. And if you react just enough to show you're affected but not enough to confront, they've found the sweet spot. This is how control is rebuilt incrementally. Many people at this stage feel tempted to outmaneuver the situation, to become sharper, more analytical, more vigilant. But that often deepens the trap because now your attention is fully captured. You're playing a game you didn't choose on a board you didn't design. The real disruption comes from something far simpler and far more difficult. Non-reactivity paired with clarity, not emotional shutdown, not passivity but calm, consistent refusal to engage with ambiguity. Clear boundaries, clear responses, no over-explaining. No defending your right to feel what you feel, just grounded presence. Indirect provocations rely on friction. They need emotional resistance to register as success. And when that resistance disappears, not because you're numb, but because you're centered, the tactic collapses. There's nothing to measure, nothing to refine, nothing to provoke, and that forces a choice. escalate openly and risk exposure, or retreat and lose relevance. Either way, the indirect control weakens. If you find yourself dealing with small, deniable disturbances that leave you doubting yourself more than the situation, pay attention. Those are not accidents, they are probes. And here is the line to hold on to. When someone keeps testing your emotional balance without ever addressing the issue directly, the test itself is the answer. You don't need to decode every remark or confront every moment. You need to notice the pattern and trust what it reveals. Because once you stop responding to hidden tests, the need to administer them disappears. And when provocation no longer produces information, the strategy must change again. That is not because you won. It is because you are no longer available to be measured. Recruiting allies in silence, how the conflict expands socially. At this stage, the conflict is no longer contained between you and them. Without warning, without announcement, it begins to spread outward. Not loudly, not aggressively, quietly. You start to feel it before you can explain it. Conversations feel slightly tilted. Familiar interactions carry a subtle tension. People respond with hesitation where there once was ease. You sense a distance that doesn't quite make sense, but nothing has happened openly enough for you to name. This is not your imagination. This is triangulation. When direct control weakens and indirect tactics begin to lose effectiveness, the narcissistic personality expands the field. The conflict is no longer just psychological or emotional. It becomes social. And this shift is one of the most destabilizing phases of all. What makes it so powerful is how understated it is. There is no call to arms, no dramatic smear campaign, no obvious recruitment of supporters. That would be too visible, too risky. Instead, allies are recruited through restraint, through selective disclosure, through carefully framed conversations, through emotional cues delivered with apparent reluctance. They do not ask people to take sides, they lead them there. This is the critical distinction. Healthy people seek support to process pain or gain perspective. In narcissistic dynamics, support is not sought, it is cultivated. The goal is not understanding, it is alignment. Because alignment creates leverage, they begin with phrases that sound measured, even ethical. I don't want to speak badly about them. I'm just trying to understand what went wrong. I really tried to make it work. Each sentence contains an invitation, not to judge but to sympathize, and sympathy once offered subtly reshapes perception. The listener begins filling in gaps, and what people fill in themselves they defend more fiercely than what they are told outright. This is why outright lies are rarely necessary. The narcissistic personality does not need to fabricate. They select, they omit, they emphasize, they frame. Partial truth is far more effective than fiction because partial truth feels trustworthy. Timing matters here, just as it did before. These conversations do not happen while emotions are raw. They happen after things have cooled, when speaking calmly appears responsible rather than reactive. That calmness gives credibility. People assume restraint equals maturity. They assume delayed disclosure equals reflection. They assume reluctance to speak equals integrity. And all of those assumptions work in their favor. Meanwhile, you are often unaware this is happening. Or if you sense it, you dismiss it. You believe adults will reserve judgment. You assume people won't draw conclusions without hearing both sides. That belief is understandable. But this is not a balanced exchange of perspectives. This is influence moving quietly through social channels. Another crucial element of this phase is selectivity. They do not recruit everyone, and they choose carefully. They gravitate toward people who value harmony over truth, comfort over complexity, loyalty over nuance. People who dislike conflict. People who want things to feel okay again. People who mistake calmness for goodness. These individuals are not malicious. They are simply susceptible to simplified narratives that promise emotional resolution. Once those alliances are in place, something shifts. The narcissistic personality is no longer just an individual with a grievance. They become the center of a reinforcing system. Each sympathetic response validates their narrative. Each nod of understanding solidifies their position. And validation does something important internally. It restores moral certainty. They are no longer just hurt. They are justified. This moral cover is essential. Because it allows them to escalate, withdraw support, undermine you, exclude you without experiencing guilt. They are no longer acting alone. They are acting in accordance with what everyone sees. That collective agreement, even if it's quiet and implicit, is incredibly powerful. What makes this stage especially painful is how it affects you internally. You begin to feel out of place in rooms you once belonged to. Conversations feel guarded. You sense that something has shifted, but you can't locate the source. There is no accusation to respond to. No rumor you can clearly refute. No moment you can point to and say, that's where it changed. So you turn inward. You replay interactions. You wonder what was said. You question whether you should clarify things. And because you value openness and fairness, your instinct is to bring things into the light. But openness here is not rewarded, it is exploited. If you speak preemptively, you risk confirming the very narrative being constructed, that you are reactive, defensive, or unstable. If you stay quiet, your silence is interpreted as confirmation. This is the bind. And it is not accidental. Triangulation works precisely because it places you in a position where any move carries risk. Meanwhile, the narcissistic personality maintains plausible deniability. They haven't accused you. They've just shared concern. Another destabilizing aspect of this phase is how aggression is offloaded onto the environment. Instead of attacking you directly, they let the social system do it for them. A raised eyebrow, a subtle exclusion, a lack of defense when you're criticized. None of it can be traced cleanly, and that deniability preserves their image. You may feel tempted to counter-recruit, to tell your side, to correct the story. But that often backfires because the system is already leaning away from complexity. Truth requires nuance. Triangulation thrives on simplicity. The more you explain, the more fragmented you may appear. The more emotional labor you expend, the less stable you may seem. And stability, at this stage, is judged more by tone than by substance. This is where social pressure begins to erode self-trust. You start asking questions that cut deeply. If everyone sees it this way, maybe I am the problem. Maybe I handled things badly. Maybe I should just make it right. That doubt is the real objective, because once you destabilize internally, external control becomes easier, and you begin compromising past your limits. You soften boundaries you worked hard to establish. You re-enter old patterns to regain belonging. And belonging, when weaponized, becomes leverage. Understanding this phase does not mean you become defensive or suspicious of everyone around you. It means you stop assuming that alignment equals truth. You recognize that consensus can form without accuracy, especially when it reduces discomfort. The way through this is not to fight for the room. It is to reclaim your center, to accept that not everyone is entitled to your explanation, to understand that relationships built on partial truth are fragile, to trust that systems requiring distortion to survive eventually collapse under clarity. And here is the line to hold on to when the room begins to feel cold. When someone needs an audience to justify how they treat you, the audience is part of the strategy, not the truth. You are not losing ground because you were wrong. You are losing ground because the conflict has expanded into a social space designed to favor coherence over honesty, And once you see that clearly, you stop chasing validation in places where alignment was never earned through understanding. You remain steady, you remain consistent, you remain anchored in your values. Because alliances formed through implication and omission cannot hold indefinitely. They require maintenance, they require reinforcement, they require ongoing distortion. Truth does not. And over time, the difference becomes visible. Not because you exposed anything, not because you fought back, but because you refused to reorganize yourself to fit a story that was never yours to begin with. Moral superiority and emotional withdrawal, when judgment replaces relationship. At this stage, something colder settles in. It doesn't arrive with hostility or noise, it arrives with certainty. The narcissistic personality begins to withdraw emotionally, but not in a way that suggests reflection, grief, or genuine detachment. Instead, the withdrawal is paired with something far more revealing: moral elevation. A subtle implication that they have outgrown you, seen through you, risen above the situation altogether. This is not distance for healing. This is disengagement as judgment. You feel it in the tone before you understand it cognitively. Conversations become clipped, responses are delayed or perfunctory. Curiosity about your inner world disappears. There is no longer any effort to understand your perspective, no interest in mutual meaning-making. And yet there is presence, a quiet, watchful presence that feels evaluative rather than relational, as if a verdict has already been reached. What is happening psychologically at this point is precise. In order to justify what they are planning, or what they have already begun to do, they need to reorganize the moral hierarchy of the relationship. They cannot see themselves as retaliatory. They cannot see themselves as vindictive. They cannot see themselves as cruel. That would fracture the self-image they have been protecting since the beginning. So instead, they elevate themselves ethically and diminish you quietly. They begin speaking in the language of principles, of boundaries, and of self-respect, of growth. Phrases appear that sound healthy in isolation but feel hollow in context. I'm protecting my peace now. I've done the work. I'm not engaging in negativity anymore. On the surface, these statements seem admirable. They echo therapeutic language. They borrow credibility from self-help culture and emotional awareness. But notice what is missing. There is no acknowledgement of shared responsibility, no openness to dialogue, no grief over the loss of connection, just certainty. And certainty, when paired with emotional withdrawal, is a warning sign. Because what they are really saying is not, "I've grown," it is, "I've judged." Once judgment replaces engagement, the relationship is no longer a relationship. It becomes a moral case file. And in that file, you are no longer a complex human being. Even you are a problem that has been diagnosed. This moral superiority serves a critical function. It allows them to disengage without guilt, to withhold empathy while feeling justified, to prepare acts of exclusion, punishment, or retaliation while maintaining the belief that they are acting virtuously. And that belief is dangerous, because people will do things in the name of righteousness that they would never do out of anger. What makes this phase especially destabilizing is how calm they appear. There is no visible malice, no overt cruelty, just a quiet finality. An emotional distance that feels dismissive rather than neutral. You may feel infantilized by it, as though you are being looked down on rather than argued with, as though your perspective no longer deserves consideration. And on that dynamic, being morally evaluated instead of emotionally engaged, can be profoundly destabilizing. It often triggers an understandable impulse to prove your goodness, to demonstrate that you are reasonable, fair, and well-intentioned, to show that you are not the caricature forming in their narrative. But that impulse is futile, because once someone has positioned themselves as morally superior, they are no longer seeking understanding. They are seeking confirmation. Every response you make is filtered through a fixed frame. If you speak up, you are reactive. If you stay quiet, you are avoidant. If you set boundaries, you are selfish. If you compromise, you are manipulative. The frame is closed. The outcome is predetermined. You cannot win inside a system designed to exclude you. And this is why compassion drops away so sharply at this stage. Nuance disappears. Complexity is flattened. They begin speaking about you in simplified terms, or not at all. When they do speak, there is a quiet disdain beneath the calm, a sense that the matter has already been settled. Complexity would reintroduce doubt, and doubt would interfere with what comes next. Because make no mistake, this emotional withdrawal is not the end of the process, it is preparation. Once they have convinced themselves, and often others, that they occupy the moral high ground, they are free to act, to cut you off, to undermine you, to retaliate in ways that would once have conflicted with their self-image. And here is the painful truth. The colder they become, the more righteous they feel, the less empathy they show, and the more convinced they are that empathy is no longer required. If you try to appeal to shared history, shared values, or shared humanity at this point, you will find nothing there to meet you. That door has already been closed. This is often the moment when people break, not because of what is being done to them, but because of what is being withdrawn. The warmth, the recognition, the sense of mutual regard. It can feel like erasure, as if your entire history has been invalidated by a silent moral decree. But this is where clarity becomes your anchor. Emotional withdrawal paired with moral superiority is not growth. It is defense. It is a way of avoiding vulnerability by replacing it with judgment. It is a strategy for maintaining coherence without connection. When you see that clearly, something shifts. You stop chasing their approval, and you stop trying to be understood by someone who has already decided not to understand. You stop explaining yourself to a closed system. Instead, you return to your own ethical center, not as a weapon, not as an argument, but as a guide. You remember that genuine moral strength does not require dehumanizing someone else. It does not require silence, superiority, or withdrawal. It can tolerate disagreement. It can hold complexity. It can stay present even when things are uncomfortable. And most importantly, it does not need to rise above another person in order to stand. The moment you stop interpreting their cold certainty as truth and start seeing it as a shield, its power diminishes. You no longer internalize their judgment as a verdict on your worth. You recognize it for what it is, an escape. And because when someone must position themselves above you in order to walk away from you, what they are escaping is not you. It is the vulnerability they cannot afford to face. And once you understand that, you stop trying to follow them into a moral hierarchy that was never about ethics in the first place. You stay grounded, you stay human, you stay whole. And that steadiness, quiet, unprovable, and deeply rooted, is something moral superiority can never replicate. Because judgment can withdraw from relationship, but it cannot replace it. And that difference becomes increasingly clear as the process continues. The power shift you don't announce. What happens when you stop explaining? There comes a moment that doesn't feel dramatic from the outside, but internally it changes everything. You stop explaining, not because you are angry, not because you are trying to punish anyone, not because you've given up. You stop because something inside you is settled. For a long time, explanation felt necessary. You explained your intentions, your boundaries, your feelings. You clarified misunderstandings. You tried to be precise, fair, and reasonable. You believed that if you could just articulate yourself clearly enough, reality would realign. That belief made sense. It came from integrity, but at some point you realized something quietly devastating. Your explanations were no longer being used to understand you. They were being used to measure you. Every clarification became material. Every justification became leverage. Every attempt at mutual understanding became another opening. And so, without announcing it, without declaring independence, without making a scene, you stopped. This is the moment the power truly shifts. Because in narcissistic dynamics, explanation is not neutral, it is participation. It keeps you inside the relational frame they control. It allows them to position themselves as the evaluator and you as the subject under review. When you explain, you are still asking to be understood. When you stop explaining, you are no longer asking. That withdrawal is not passive, it is decisive. At first, this shift feels subtle even to you. You don't plan it. You don't rehearse it. You simply feel less compelled to fill the silence, less urgency to defend your perspective, less need to correct distortions that are clearly not misunderstandings. You begin responding differently. Shorter answers, clearer boundaries, fewer emotional disclosures, not cold, not hostile. You're just unavailable for misinterpretation. And this is where many people misjudge what's happening. They assume silence means defeat. They think the person who stops explaining has lost the argument or surrendered the narrative. But in this dynamic, the opposite is true. The person who stops explaining has exited the game. Because explanations only have power when the other person is open to receiving them in good faith. When that openness disappears, continuing to explain does not preserve truth. It erodes self-respect. This is why stopping feels like relief. Your nervous system begins to settle. You are no longer rehearsing conversations in your head. You are no longer anticipating distortions. You are no longer scanning for opportunities to be understood. Your energy returns to you. And from their perspective, this is deeply unsettling. And because explanation is not just communication, it is engagement. It signals investment. It confirms relevance. As long as you were explaining, you were still orienting around them. When you stop, that orientation collapses. They may feel it immediately, even if they can't name it. The familiar emotional signals are gone. The predictable loops no longer activate. The feedback they relied on disappears. This is not indifference. This is absence of supply. And absence of supply is experienced as threat. What's important to understand is that you do not announce this shift. You don't say, "I'm done explaining." You don't justify your silence. You don't frame it as a boundary discussion. You simply behave differently. And behavior speaks louder than any declaration ever could. And this is why the shift often triggers a response after a long period of quiet. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's sudden. But something changes, because from their internal logic, your silence is not neutrality. It is rejection, not rejection of them as a person, but rejection of the hierarchy that once placed them at the center of your emotional world. And that hierarchy mattered. Up until now, everything they did, silence, narrative control, surveillance, strategic kindness, provocation, social alignment, moral superiority, was designed to keep you oriented around them, to keep you explaining, to keep you responding, to keep you invested. When you stop explaining, you remove the axis around which the entire strategy revolved, and what replaces explanation is something far more powerful: clarity without defense. You no longer feel compelled to convince. You no longer feel the need to correct every distortion. You no longer chase alignment. You stand where you are. This is not arrogance. It is not emotional shutdown. It is the quiet confidence of someone who no longer requires validation from a system that cannot offer it honestly. From the outside, this can look like calm, or distance, or disengagement. But internally, it feels like integration. You know what happened. You know why you set the boundary. You know what you are no longer willing to tolerate. And that knowing does not require explanation. This is why the power shift is so difficult to detect in real time. There is no dramatic marker, No final conversation, no closure moment, just a gradual reorientation of your energy away from proving and toward living. And this reorientation has consequences. Because when you stop explaining, the strategies that depended on your engagement begin to fail. Provocations don't land the same way. Kindness doesn't bypass your clarity. Narratives lose traction without your emotional response. There is nothing left to manage. This is often when the narcissistic personality feels exposed, not because you attacked them, but because your independence reveals something they've been trying to avoid. Their influence was never guaranteed. It depended on your participation. And now, that participation is ended. This is why the period after you stop explaining can feel paradoxical. On one hand, you feel freer, more grounded, less reactive. On the other hand, tension may spike, because from their perspective, the loss of your explanations is not peace, and it is annihilation. Not of you, but of the role you played. And roles once abandoned cannot be reclaimed through force without revealing desperation. This is why the power shift you don't announce is the most destabilizing one of all. It does not argue. It does not defend. It does not negotiate. It simply withdraws consent. You are no longer orienting yourself around how you are perceived. You are no longer managing someone else's interpretation of your reality. You are living from your own center. And that center is not something they can access. The final and most important thing to understand about this stage is this. Stopping explanation is not about winning. It is about exiting dynamics that require you to disappear in order to be accepted. You are not proving anything anymore. You are not waiting for understanding. And you are not hoping for fairness from a system that depends on distortion. You are standing in truth without asking it to rescue you. And that is the moment when power shifts. Not outwardly, not socially, not theatrically, but internally, quietly, decisively, irreversibly, because once you stop explaining, you are no longer available to be managed. And that changes what comes next in ways no argument ever could. The final escalation. Why independence triggers desperation. There is a moment that marks the true breaking point in this entire process, and it doesn't look the way most people expect. It isn't loud at first. It isn't dramatic right away. It doesn't announce itself as an ending. It begins the moment your independence becomes real, not performative, not temporary, not reactive, real. Up until now, everything that happened, silence, surveillance, strategic kindness, indirect provocation, social triangulation, moral withdrawal, served one purpose: to keep you emotionally oriented around them. Even conflict kept you connected. Even pain kept you engaged. But independence changes the equation entirely. When you stop explaining, stop reacting, stop adjusting yourself to maintain emotional equilibrium with them, something fundamental collapses inside their internal world. Because for a narcissistic personality, independence is not neutral. It is interpreted as rejection, not rejection of behavior, not rejection of the relationship, rejection of relevance. And irrelevance is the one thing they cannot tolerate. Their sense of self has been organized around being central, needed, admired, feared, pursued, or at least reacted to. And as long as they occupied space in your emotional field, they existed with definition. When that space disappears, what's left is not disappointment. It is identity fracture. This is why independence often triggers what feels like a sudden escalation after a long period of quiet. From your perspective, it seems unfair. You haven't attacked. You haven't retaliated. You've simply turned inward and begun living your life. But from their perspective, your autonomy is not peace. It is annihilation. Everything up to this point relied on your participation. Even your resistance provided confirmation that they still mattered. When you withdraw emotionally, not in anger but in clarity, you remove the final source of validation, and that loss is experienced as humiliation, Not because you humiliated them, but because they no longer have a role in defining themselves through you. This is where desperation enters. Desperation does not always look frantic. Often it looks calculated, cold, administrative, controlled. Because when emotional control is lost, instrumental control becomes more appealing. This is why escalation at this stage often feels disproportionate. A sudden accusation, a legal or reputational move, an abrupt cutoff, a final attempt to provoke a reaction through fear, obligation, or consequence. To you, it feels like it came out of nowhere. To them, it has been building internally for a long time. The difference now is that restraint no longer feels worthwhile. The relationship is no longer a source of supply. The cost-benefit analysis shifts. There is nothing left to preserve. So escalation feels justified. This is also why the escalation is often framed as principle rather than emotion. They don't say, "I can't stand that you don't need me anymore." They say, "I'm standing up for myself." They don't say, "I feel erased." They say, "I won't tolerate disrespect." The language is moralized, because moral framing allows retaliation without self-reflection. It transforms desperation into righteousness. What's particularly painful about this phase is how unjust it feels. You may find yourself thinking, "I didn't do anything to deserve this." And you're right. But the escalation was never about what you did. It was about what you stopped doing. You stopped supplying emotional orientation. You stopped providing reactions. You stopped needing them, and that loss of need destabilizes everything. And this is the moment when many people are tempted to re-engage, not out of weakness, but out of empathy. You may feel an impulse to soften the blow, to reassure them that they still matter, to explain that your independence is not an attack. That impulse comes from decency, and in this context it is dangerous, because reassurance reopens the door. The narcissistic personality does not need closure. They need control. And the moment you re-enter the emotional exchange, even to be kind, the cycle restarts. Your independence is delayed. Your clarity is compromised. The hierarchy is restored. This is why true independence often requires tolerating misunderstanding. Being willing to be miscast. Being willing to be seen as cold or unfair. Being willing to let someone believe a story about you that is not accurate, and not because you agree with it, but because correcting it would cost you your center. This is one of the hardest truths in this process. Sometimes the price of peace is being misunderstood by someone who cannot accept your autonomy without feeling diminished by it. And that price is still lower than the cost of re-entanglement. At this stage, calm becomes threatening to them. Not your calm words, your calm existence, because calm cannot be manipulated easily. It does not generate leverage. It does not invite engagement. It does not offer an emotional handle to grab. It simply exists, and existence without engagement is intolerable to someone whose identity depends on impact. This is why retaliation, if it comes, should be understood clearly, not as strength, not as justice, not as confidence, but as desperation, a last attempt to restore a hierarchy that no longer exists. Your task at this point becomes deceptively simple and profoundly difficult. You do not match intensity. You do not defend your independence as if it were a crime. You do not explain your peace to someone who profits from your turmoil. You stay oriented toward your values, your work, your responsibilities, your future, because independence is not an argument, it is a fact. Over time, something important happens. The strategies that once worked stop working. Provocations fall flat. Narratives lose traction. Surveillance yields nothing of interest. Without emotional return on investment, attention shifts elsewhere. Not because they grew, but because the supply dried up. And that is not revenge, it is consequence. If you are standing at this threshold, no longer entangled, ye not yet fully free, understand this. The final escalation is not the most violent moment. It is the most revealing one. It shows you exactly what your independence cost them, and it shows you exactly why you needed it. Because nothing exposes a control-based dynamic more clearly than the moment control is no longer possible. And when someone reacts to your selfhood as if it were an attack, that reaction tells you everything you need to know. Your independence did not break the relationship. It revealed what the relationship required from you in order to survive. And once you see that clearly, there is no unseeing it. What comes next is not about surviving them. It is about choosing yourself. Without apology, without explanation, and without returning to a system that could only function when you were smaller. That is the final escalation. Oh, and it is also the beginning of the end. When your calm becomes their crisis, freedom, clarity, and the end of control. There is a moment that doesn't look like victory. It doesn't feel triumphant. It doesn't announce itself with relief or celebration. It arrives quietly. You wake up one day and realize that your body is no longer braced. Your thoughts are no longer circling. Your energy is no longer pulled outward towards someone who once occupied the center of your emotional life. You are calm, not performatively calm, not numbed, not detached out of fear. Calm because you are no longer negotiating your reality. And that calm, more than any boundary, more than any confrontation, more than any explanation, is what finally ends the dynamic. Because for a narcissistic personality, your calm is not neutral, it is catastrophic. Up until now, control depended on movement, on reaction, on explanation, on emotional fluctuation. Whether you were defending yourself, appeasing, pushing back, or trying to make sense of things, your engagement kept the system alive. Even conflict was useful, even pain was productive. But calm is different. Calm does not argue, it does not perform, it does not explain itself. Calm simply exists. And existence without engagement is intolerable to someone whose identity depends on impact. This is the moment when the final illusion collapses. The illusion that they were ever in control of you. What they controlled was your attention, your emotional availability, your willingness to stay oriented around them. When that orientation disappears, there is nothing left to manage. This is why, from their perspective, your calm feels like crisis. And they may escalate one last time. They may attempt a final provocation. They may disappear entirely or harden into contempt. But whatever form it takes, the underlying experience is the same. They can no longer reach you. Not because you built higher walls, not because you became colder, but because you stepped out of the psychological cage entirely. And the most unsettling truth, for them, is this. The door was never locked from the outside. Your calm reveals something they cannot tolerate seeing. That their influence depended on your participation. That the dynamic only functioned as long as you were emotionally available to be managed. Once that availability ends, the hierarchy dissolves. This is where freedom actually begins. Not the dramatic kind, not the vindictive kind, the quiet, grounded kind. A freedom that doesn't require proving anything. Freedom that doesn't need witnesses. Freedom that doesn't demand justice in order to exist. You stop checking for reactions. You stop wondering what they think. You stop calibrating your behavior around their potential response. Your life reorganizes itself, not around avoidance, but around meaning. This is why the end of control often feels anticlimactic. There is no final showdown, no apology, no moment of mutual understanding, just distance that no longer hurts, and clarity that no longer needs validation. At first, this can feel disorienting. After so much intensity, calm can feel unfamiliar. You may even question it. Wonder if you're suppressing something, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But over time, you notice something profound. Your energy returns. You invested in your work, in your relationships, your growth. not to prove anything, but because you are finally free to choose where your attention goes. This is the stage where the narcissistic personality truly loses power, not because you defeated them, but because power was never something they could hold without your consent. Control requires access. Influence requires reaction. Dominance requires engagement. Your calm removes all three. What's important to understand is that this ending is not cruel. It is not punishment. It is consequence. When someone builds their sense of self on controlling another person's emotional world, the natural consequence of that person reclaiming themselves is collapse. Not of the person, but of the strategy. And that collapse is not your responsibility to manage. You may never be understood by them. You may never be seen fairly. You may never receive acknowledgement for what you endured. But none of that is required for freedom. Freedom does not need agreement. It needs clarity, and clarity is what you have now. You understand what the silence meant. You understand what the kindness was testing. You understand why independence triggered desperation. And most importantly, you understand why staying calm, truly calm, ends the cycle. Because calm is not emptiness. It is fullness without chaos. It is selfhood without defense. It is life no longer organized around someone else's wounds. This is the end of control, not with drama, not with revenge, not with exposure, but with irrelevance. The moment you stop being a source of emotional fuel, the system has nothing left to feed on. And what replaces it is something far more powerful than vindication: peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on someone else's behavior. The kind that belongs to you. The kind that does not need permission. The kind that remains even when misunderstood. When your calm becomes their crisis, you don't respond to the crisis. You don't fix it. You don't soothe it. You don't engage with it. You keep living. And that is the final truth of this entire journey. You were never trapped by them. You were trapped by a system that required your participation to survive. The moment you stepped out, not angrily, not loudly, but clearly, the system collapsed. Not because you destroyed it, but because it could not exist without you inside it. And that is what freedom actually looks like. Quiet, grounded, unarguable. The door was never locked. And now, you are no longer inside the cage. This story is not about a single argument, a single person, or a single moment of betrayal. It is about a slow psychological journey, one that begins in confusion and ends in clarity. At the start, the main character believed that honesty would be enough, that patience would bring understanding, and that emotional maturity would eventually stabilize the relationship. They believed silence meant peace, kindness meant repair, and distance meant detachment. Each assumption made sense. Each assumption was human, and each one was quietly used against them. What unfolded instead was a pattern. Silence became strategy. Calm became camouflage. Kindness became a test. Distance became surveillance. The relationship stopped being relational and slowly transformed into a system of control. Not loud control, not violent control, but psychological control, subtle, deniable, and deeply destabilizing. The character tried to respond with more clarity, more empathy, more explanation, believing that if they could just be understood, the tension would dissolve. But understanding was never the goal. Control was. Over time, the cost became internal. Self-doubt replaced confidence. Hypervigilance replaced ease. The character began scanning conversations, managing impressions, questioning their instincts. They were still functioning, still kind, still reasonable, but smaller. Less centered, less free. And that shrinking was not accidental. It was the byproduct of staying emotionally available inside a system that required confusion to survive. The turning point did not come with a confrontation. It came with exhaustion, and then with stillness. The character stopped explaining, not as punishment, not as protest, but as recognition. They realized their words were no longer bridges. They were tools being repurposed. And in that quiet withdrawal, something extraordinary happened. Their nervous system settled. Their attention returned. Their life began to reorganize around meaning instead of management. That internal shift triggered the final escalation. Independence was interpreted as rejection. Calm was perceived as threat. The system reacted not because the character had done something wrong, but because they had stepped out of the role required to keep it alive. And that reaction revealed the truth more clearly than any argument ever could. The relationship could only exist if one person stayed small. The story ends not with revenge or validation, but with freedom. Quiet freedom, grounded freedom, and the kind that does not need witnesses or apologies. The character did not win by defeating anyone. They won by leaving a game that was costing them their sense of self. The deeper lesson here is this: not every conflict is meant to be resolved through communication. Some dynamics do not break because of misunderstanding, but because of clarity. When someone needs your confusion, your emotional availability, or your self-doubt in order to feel secure, the most powerful thing you can do is become whole again. Applied to real life, this means learning to trust patterns over promises. It means evaluating behavior, not tone. It means understanding that kindness without accountability is not safety, and silence without repair is not peace. Most importantly, it means recognizing that you do not need to explain your truth to someone who is invested in misunderstanding you. Healing does not always look like closure. Sometimes it looks like walking away with your integrity intact and your nervous system at rest. Sometimes it looks like being misunderstood and choosing not to correct it. Sometimes it looks like calm and letting that calm speak for itself. Before we close, here's a quick question for you. Question: when someone suddenly becomes calm and kind after conflict, what is more important to pay attention to? A, their words and tone. B, their behavior over time. Comment A or B below and let us know your answer. And now, we'd love to hear from you. Have you experienced something similar? What part of this story resonated most with you? Or what insight changed the way you see past relationships? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your perspective. If this content helped you see things more clearly, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating deep, honest content that brings clarity, strength, and emotional freedom to those who need it most.